Hey, what's up? It's cute. What if? This side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku gained Soul Reaper powers. Before we move ahead with the FIC, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. 1000 Cherry Blossoms. In Muzutafu General Hospital, two young siblings sat with their mother in a doctor's office. Izumi Yagi, 4 years old, had blonde hair and green eyes. Her stepbrother Izuku Yagi was 5, with black hair threaded with dark green highlights and forest-colored eyes. Their mother, Izuku Yagi, was a well-known pro-hero, the number 14 Teleknet. Dr. Ujiko explained that there was good news and bad news. He told Inko that Izumi had an inferior version of her quirk. She could do what Inko could, but with only about half the strength for now, and it would take training of both mind and body to grow. Inko brightened at the prospect and encouraged Izumi that she could become a powerful hero. Izuku cheered for his sister, and Izumi returned his energy with a nod. Noting Dr. Ujiko's troubled expression, Inko asked what was wrong. The doctor told her that Izuku was quirkless, his quirk factor registered at 0. Izuku dropped the All Might figurine he had been holding, and Izumi, Inko, and the doctor looked on with worry and awkward silence. Dr. Ujiko reflected that they had run several tests, including X-rays and the quirk factor analysis. Inko struggled to reconcile their son's diagnosis with her excitement for Izumi. She spoke cheerfully that Izumi could become the next symbol of peace, but in her relief and hope she overlooked Izuku. The family left the hospital quickly, Izumi and Inko full of plans while Izuku followed behind, feeling smaller. Dr. Ujiko watched them go and shook his head with quiet regret. At home, the couple's public and private lives intersected awkwardly. Toshinori Yagi, known to the world as All Might, though few knew the truth, greeted them. He asked how the appointment had gone. Inko told him that Izuku was quirkless but that Izumi had inherited a version of her quirk that could grow with training. Toshinori celebrated the news for Izumi and suggested they celebrate at once. They celebrated while Izuku retreated to his room for comfort, watching a favorite video and hoping someone would come by to reassure him. No one did. That night he cried himself to sleep, longing for his family's attention. School brought no reprieve. Izuku expected friendly faces, play, and encouragement, but the other children began to avoid him. Katsuki Bakugo, a sandy-haired boy with an explosive quirk and a fiery temper, singled him out for harsh treatment. Katsuki would use his quirk to create brief bursts that singed Izuku's clothing and left painful reminders. Teachers observed but did not intervene, and Izuku learned quickly that asking for help would not change what happened. Shoto Todoroki treated Izuku differently. Shoto sometimes joined in the taunting but more often offered quiet apologies and subtle aid after incidents, using his ice quirk to help cool and soothe singed areas. Izuku felt conflicted about Shoto. He disliked Izumi and Katsuki, but Shoto occupied a more ambiguous place in his feelings. At home, life offered little comfort. He returned from school with bandages and marks that went unnoticed. Meals were often his responsibility to prepare, and when he asked his mother to play, she told him she was busy and turned her attention to Izumi. When he asked his father to train him, he received the same response. Promises were made about playing and training later, but they were rarely kept. Izuku learned to rely on himself. By 7 years old, Izuku found himself sprinting through a forest, panting and scanning for a place to hide. The chase had started after Katsuki had found a sketch Izuku had drawn of his own hero costume. Katsuki had shown it to Izumi, and together they organized what they called the Deku Hunt. The game sent many classmates after him, the first to capture Izuku and bring him to the overseers Izumi, Katsuki, and Shoto would win a bag of candy and snacks. Izuku dodged branches and pushed through undergrowth, the shouts of the other children echoing behind him. As he ran, a small pink petal drifted past on the breeze toward his right. He glanced to his right and saw a small petal land in front of a narrow opening in the rock wall that rose like a mountain. Izuku had never seen this place before and wondered where the hole might lead. He had explored every other part of the forest near his hometown, but he had never been here. He would have searched elsewhere for shelter, but his pursuers were closing in. The hole was just large enough for Izuku to squeeze through. He slid in, wriggled toward a light he took to be an exit, and slipped out on the other side. Pressing his ear to the thin stone beside him, he could hear the voices of his bullies growing more distant as they moved away. When he turned, he was met by an incredible sight. The opening revealed a wide clearing of green grass and a placid pond in the middle, hidden deep in the mountains. On a small hill stood a cherry tree in full bloom, petals fluttering around it. Izuku felt a rush of confusion. February should not have been cherry blossom season, yet he was captivated by the tree's beauty. Each branch held pretty pink petals, and Izuku, who had always loved nature, instinctively reached out to touch the trunk. He felt a quiet connection, a sense of belonging that he understood without needing words. In that moment, Izuku found a place he could call home. 3 years passed since that day. Now 10 years old, Izuku had grown happier in ways that infuriated Izumi and Katsuki. He trained in secret at his hidden sanctuary. Shoto, who carried his own regrets about past behavior, felt quietly relieved to see Izuku change and kept promising himself he would apologize when the time was right. Katsuki and Izumi, however, were determined to break Izuku's spirit. They taunted him openly at school. Katsuki called him a nerd and mocked him, and Izuku stammered in response. Together they urged him toward a cruel joke. They told him he could get a quirk by performing a reckless stunt, suggesting he should jump from a roof and hope to be reborn with a quirk so he would no longer disappoint his parents. Shoto watched the confrontation and felt the weight of guilt, intending to apologize, but Izuku fled the classroom in tears before anyone could intervene. Izuku ran back to the only place where he felt safe. He crawled through the familiar opening into the hidden field, unaware that 2 people had followed him. The hill was still green, and the cherry tree looked even more alive now that it was spring. The tree, Izuku believed, had a will of its own. Whenever he felt low, it somehow comforted him. He sat beneath it and picked up a small dead branch that had fallen, noticing the odd number of petals left on it. He began plucking petals while whispering to himself that he should die and then that he should not, alternating between despair and a faint glimmer of hope. He continued until only 1 petal remained, and just as tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, a single cherry blossom petal drifted down and landed on his nose. A sudden burst of relief and joy washed through him, and he cried for a different reason, this time tears of happiness. He left the clearing with a lighter heart and went home to the Yagi residence, where Inko asked about Izumi. Izuku answered coldly that he did not know and retreated to his sparse room, where exhaustion sent him to sleep. The next day began with the brief relief of finding that Katsuki and Izumi were not present at school. That relief evaporated when Shoto approached him, panic in his expression, and told Izuku that Katsuki and Izumi had announced a plan to destroy his hideout. Seeing the fear in Izuku's eyes, Shoto understood how important the place was to him. Izuku bolted from the school, ignoring teachers who called after him. He did not notice the smirks from the 2 who had been watching. When he reached the mountainside, the familiar small entrance was gone. In its place was a larger opening bordered by scorch marks. He raced inside. The clearing had been devastated. Patches of scorched earth scarred the lawn. The pond was partly obstructed by a fallen boulder, and most painfully, the cherry tree he had grown to love had been toppled. Izuku collapsed to his knees at the sight, tears streaming down his face. He let out a raw, anguished scream of grief and fury, and he clenched his fists so tightly that his hands ached from the pressure. As he screamed, he did not notice that the fallen tree's remaining petals began to glow a bright pink. They lifted into the air, spiraling around him in a whirlwind of blossoms in a suddenly surreal, almost otherworldly moment. From that swirling vortex of petals emerged the gleam of a katana, framed by the 1,000 blossoms that danced in the air. The whirlwind of cherry blossoms and the bright blade were the last things Izuku saw before everything changed. Liberation. A boy groggily woke up in his room. His first thought was, where am I? The boy was Izuku Yagi. He recognized the room and, piecing things together, remembered the loss that had hollowed him out. Tears gathered and streamed down his freckled cheeks. The one safe place he had felt he still had been taken away. He wondered why the world seemed so cruel to him. A voice told him not to cry. Izuku looked around and saw no one. He told himself he must be imagining it, forcing a strained smile while the tears kept falling. Izuku asked what time it was and, reaching for the bedside table, his eyes widened at the sight of a beautifully crafted katana beside the clock. He noticed the hilt was bronze with purple wrapping and diamond cutouts, and a bronze crossguard. The sheath was clean white with a purple ribbon at the side. He picked up the sword and found it surprisingly light. When he drew it, he admired the ebony black of the blade. A sudden pressure slammed into him and forced him to his knees. The voice whispered that he should say its name. He was on his knees, and the window glass had cracked and the floorboards had split under the force. Izuku realized the disturbance would have been noticeable if anyone else were home. He assumed they were out with Izumi and felt the bitter edge of loneliness. He tried to pull the sword free from his arms, but it felt as if the blade had a will of its own. The voice demanded his attention again, and this time it sounded fiercer. Izuku answered that he did not know its name. The voice sighed and murmured that it would help him remember. The sword moved as if guided by an unseen hand, and Izuku found himself unable to resist. He raised the blade toward his own torso even as he tried to stop it. He felt a sharp impact and light flared. Pain surged through him and he crumpled. Energy seemed to spill from him instead of blood, and the world around him dimmed. As his vision blurred, he saw a man in a mask and samurai attire standing above him with his arms folded. Izuku thought to himself that in that moment he truly was Deku, and then everything went dark. When he opened his eyes again, bright light made him squint and he groaned softly. He allowed his vision to adjust and then looked around. He was lying on grass, feeling a warmth that was not just sunlight but something like comfort. He sat up and took in a small pond with clear water and fish leaping, green blades of grass all around, and mountains encircling the clearing. A small hill rose a few meters ahead. He climbed the hill and found a lone cherry blossom tree at the peak, its branches heavy with petals. Izuku touched the tree with the palm of his hand and felt wetness at his eyes. He wiped at his face and wondered aloud why he was crying and why he felt as if he were forgetting something precious. He felt an urge to connect himself with the tree and pressed his forehead to its trunk, placing a hand against it for support. A sharp headache struck him. Memory, age 7. A 7-year-old boy ran around the clearing playing with small animals. There were no other people, only bushes and branches that rose from the ground, and the single tree on the hill. The boy tripped on a root and scraped his knee. Tears threatened, but he refused to cry, and the animals gathered around in concern. A single cherry blossom petal drifted down and landed on the scrape. A pink light emanated from the petal as it faded away, and the scrape vanished as if healed. The boy thought it was cool and moved on. Memory, age 8.5. The boy sometimes felt watched, not by someone threatening but as if a protective older guardian watched over him. When he felt lonely, the sensation returned and he felt warmth. When he felt sad, the feeling made him lighter. When he felt in danger, it made him feel safe. The feeling was strongest near the lone tree. Memory, age 9.8. The boy had grown very attached to this place. The boy had grown attached to the lone cherry tree that stood on a small hill. One day, bored, he spent his time counting each individual petal. He had a photographic memory, so he did not need to recount if he were to forget. He noted that there were 1,001 cherry blossom petals. Just then a single petal fell and landed on the boy's head. He giggled and said it must be 1,000 now. He thought for a moment, and an idea struck him. The tree needed a name. He pointed at the tree and decided that, with its 1,000 petals, it should be called 1,000 cherry blossoms. As if agreeing, the tree's petals rustled and a single petal landed on his head again. The boy said that even though there were now 999 petals, he would still call him by the same name. The boy sometimes caught a movement out of the corner of his eye. When he played with the animals, he would glimpse a tall, masked figure beside the tree. When he played at the pond, the figure would be near the tree again. It was always at the tree. When he sat, leaning against the tree, he felt the same presence on the other side. The presence did not feel dangerous. It felt welcoming. Izuku's tears fell freely. His 10-year-old body trembled with a mix of sadness and relief as he realized the man remembered him. He did not turn at first, but he knew who stood behind him. The figure was tall, wearing a red and gold oni mask, long hair tied in a ponytail, a purple kimono with white stripes and samurai armor over his shoulders and chest. Red metal-plated gauntlets covered his forearms, and purple trousers were tucked into red metal boots. A white sash cinched his waist. The masked man observed that Izuku remembered, and Izuku answered with sarcasm and tears that he could never forget. When Izuku finally turned to face him, he demanded how the man could be standing there in physical form when he should not be alive. The masked man explained that he had never been only a tree. His spirit had been trapped inside, waiting for a rightful heir. Izuku asked what the man meant by heir, overwhelmed by questions. Izuku asked why the man would choose him. The man countered by asking why not him. Izuku kept his head low and described himself as useless, quirkless, and weak, calling himself a Deku. The masked man challenged each of those judgments, asking who had decided Izuku was useless, weak, or powerless, repeating the questions until a small spark of hope returned to Izuku's eyes. The man crouched, tapped Izuku's chest with a gentle finger, and said that the only one who gets to decide was Izuku himself. Izuku's eyes widened and a light returned to them. Overwhelmed, he fainted. He woke in his room, a place haunted by painful memories but also the place where freedom felt possible. He stood up with the sword still lodged against him, a faint pink glow forming around his body as a strange aura covered him. A renewed fire lit his eyes. He gripped the sword's handle and instead of pulling it free, he pushed it further, and a surge of power coursed through him. The masked man watched with a quiet, measured amusement. The sword flared with bright pink light, and Izuku trembled with new strength. The world shifted, and he found himself kneeling where the mighty Sakura tree had once stood. The masked man towered before him like a guardian. The man told Izuku that they were one and the same. The sword glowed brighter and blue energy swirled around the kneeling boy. Izuku swore to serve and cut down anything that stood between his master and their goal. He fixed his gaze on the masked man with fierce determination. The man instructed him to call the sword's name, and when Izuku did, the blade shattered into 1,000 pieces that transformed into wings of cherry blossom petals at his back. Izuku felt utterly free and liberated. Night passed and morning came. The next morning, Izuku woke half expecting it all to have been a dream, but he saw the faint movement of Senbon at the edge of his vision and knew otherwise. Senbon greeted him with a gentle, almost fatherly tone and asked how he had slept. Izuku said that his sleep had been peaceful and liberating, a rest he had not felt in a long time. Senbon, having spent much time with his new wielder, understood what Izuku meant. Izuku then asked worried, practical questions about what to do next, whether he should tell his parents and friends, whether they would be able to see Senbon, and whether they would notice the sword and try to take it from him. Senbon gently interrupted him with a playful but firm gesture and told him to calm down before answering. He explained that Izuku should not tell anyone about his existence. If anyone ever discovered the sword in its weapon form, Senbon advised that Izuku simply claimed to be training in Kenjutsu to become a professional swordsman, since Izuku would actually gain real skill under the blade's guidance. Senbon went on to explain that others could not see him unless Izuku willed it. He added that Izuku did not yet have the mental focus or stamina to project such control reliably, and attempting to force it now would be dangerous. Senbon told Izuku that they would focus on that task in the far future and that someone like him would eventually be able to see him. Izuku felt confused but went along, not understanding half of it. Senbon noticed his confusion and reassured him that he would understand in time. Senbon then explained that no one could take the sword from Izuku if he kept it hidden. Izuku raised an eyebrow, and Senbon elaborated that, because they were connected in mind and soul, Izuku could absorb the sword. The sword was simply a place for Senbon to reside. When Izuku panicked and demanded to know how, Senbon instructed him to hold the sword and focus on absorbing it, reminding him that they were one and two at once and that absorbing it would simply give the sword a temporary place to rest while not in use. Izuku did as instructed and focused. Senbon told him that they were one and the same yet distinct. A bright blue glow filled the room, followed by a soft pink light as the katana vanished. Senbon asked how he felt. Izuku said he felt fine but different, as if something else were moving inside him. He suddenly yelped and clutched his head in pain, and Senbenzakura reacted the same way. Images flooded Izuku's mind, men dressed in white and black armed with unusual weapons, an ancient society of traditional houses and temples, people displaying strange powers. He saw a man clad in black with a white cloak, long black hair flowing to his waist, manipulating cherry blossom petals like a weapon. He also saw masked creatures with eerie, hollow marks on their chests and warriors in black and white clothing battling them, while others in plain black robes watched or fought. Izuku gasped and panted, then asked what had just happened and whether Senbenzakura was all right. Senbenzakura said he was fine but thought he had just experienced Izuku's memories from a third-person perspective and asked what Izuku had seen. Izuku replied that it had been more than a single memory. He had seen strange people with large weapons fighting those hollow-marked creatures. Senbenzakura grew thoughtful and questioned what Izuku was, wondering aloud whether Izuku's ability could be a quirk. He noted that quirks were generally part of human genetics and not fully sentient or capable of existing independently of the brain. Senbenzakura sighed and decided it was time to explain. He asked Izuku to sit and get comfortable because the story would be long. Izuku nodded and sat on his bed while Senbenzakura remained standing. Senbenzakura began by describing a long-ago era, nearly 1,000 years past, when people with unusual abilities lived. Those people wielded special weapons that housed souls though not human souls. They had lived apart from ordinary human life in a place called the Soul Society, or, more simply, the afterlife. Izuku asked whether the Soul Society was like heaven and wondered why beings there would need weapons or powers instead of living peacefully. Senbenzakura clarified that the afterlife was not the same as the comforting idea of heaven and that he needed to explain the beings called hollows to make sense of it. Senbenzakura described hollows as spirits formed when certain human souls failed to pass on to the Soul Society. If a soul lingered in the human world too long or was consumed by despair, regret, or obsessive grudges, it could become corrupted. These corrupted spirits developed supernatural abilities and preyed upon wandering souls and sometimes harmed the living. Normally, Shinigami handled the transition of souls to the afterlife. Without that guidance, a soul might fall into obsession and lose its humanity, becoming a hollow and endangering others. Izuku asked whether Shinigami were merely a myth. Senbenzakura explained that Shinigami were once residents of the Soul Society whose name meant Soul Reaper or Death God. Their duty had been to eliminate hollows and guide lost spirits to the afterlife. When Izuku wondered why Senbenzakura spoke of them in the past tense, Senbenzakura revealed that Shinigami were now nearly extinct. He recalled a war nearly 1,000 years ago between the Shinigami and another race. The Shinigami had won but suffered heavy losses. After the war, both the number of hollows and the Shinigami declined for reasons that were not entirely clear. Some Shinigami retired to live quietly on Earth, others simply vanished. Izuku apologized for not knowing the history and asked whether the other race in the war had been the Hollows. Senbenzakura corrected him, saying the other race had been the Quincy, but added that Izuku did not need to know the full details now and that, in any case, the Quincy were thought to be extinct, or at least Senbenzakura hoped so. Izuku did not catch Senbenzakura's trailing remark. Excitedly, Izuku assumed quirks had existed 1,000 years ago. Senbenzakura clarified that quirks were a genetic mutation within humans, whereas the Soul Reapers were a separate race born with the innate ability to wield Zanpakuto. When Izuku asked what a Zanpakuto was, Senbenzakura explained that a Zanpakuto was a blade that housed a soul reflecting its wielder. The Zanpakuto itself was sentient, possessing its own presence and power that could manifest to empower the sword. Senbenzakura explained that each Zanpakuto is unique and has its own name. He added that lower-ranking Shinigami carry a type called a Sachi. The nameless swords, which have nameless souls, are artificially created and lack much Ryuryoku or Ryatsu. Izuku asked what Ryatsu and Ryuryoku were. Senbenzakura explained that Ryuryoku is the energy stored within the body or soul, while Ryatsu is the pressure that Ryuryoku exerts. Ryuryoku is potential, Ryatsu is energy in use, and it can be sensed by spiritually aware beings. Those with high Ryuryoku generally have high Ryatsu as well. Izuku asked how much Ryuryoku he had. Senbenzakura observed that the most trained Shinigami carry Ryoryoku and Ryatsu like a calm sea, vast and potentially deadly when stirred, whereas Izuku's spiritual energy resembled a raging ocean, destructive but full of potential. Izuku lit up with excitement. Senbenzakura warned that such energy was dangerous and said they would begin training in sword mastery and in controlling Ryatsu and Ryoryoku properly. Izuku eagerly agreed. Izuku admitted he preferred a nickname because Senbenzakura's name was a mouthful, and Senbenzakura smiled and accepted being called Senator when Izuku pressed about memories and a man who manipulated cherry blossom petals who looked like Senbenzakura. Senbenzakura said that story would come later and that Izuku would learn the truth in time. He then ordered Izuku to drop and do 50 exercises in a strict, instructional tone. Izuku responded with a crisp acknowledgement and began the repetitions. Senbenzakura wondered to himself how someone related to that man could be so different. Later, while walking, Senbenzakura materialized behind Izuku and playfully struck him, causing Izuku to yelp. Senbenzakura reminded him that they could communicate telepathically when they were outside and that they did not need extra attention. Izuku admitted that speaking telepathically still felt strange. He then asked Sen if either of them had felt watched. Senbenzakura dismissed it as Izuku's imagination but cast a quick glance at the roof of a nearby building where a figure stood with a humanoid silhouette levitating beside him. Senbenzakura asked how Izuku was handling the return to school. Izuku admitted uncertainty and said he disliked Izumi and Katsuki even more now. He remained unsure about a boy named Shoto Todoroki. Shoto had not participated in the bullying or the group hunt and had warned Izuku about Izumi and Katsuki targeting the cherry blossom tree or Senbenzakura. Senbenzakura said he would keep an eye on Shoto. School had just ended, and Izuku prepared to leave. The day had been notable. He had avoided being bullied, and he had found a letter in his locker instructing him to meet at the park a block from school after classes. Senbenzakura urged him to go, suggesting the meeting might be important and promising to protect him if things turned dangerous. Izuku thanked Sen and went to the park. The park was one Izuku remembered vividly. He had played there every day with Izumi, Katsuki, and Shoto. Now it was neglected, rusty slides and swings, dead bushes, and dusty playsets. While he waited, Izuku thought about how everything had changed 5 years earlier and wondered how things might have been different. His thoughts were cut off by a voice he knew well. Shoto stood before him with cold gray eyes. Izuku greeted him without emotion. Shoto bowed his head and then suddenly apologized, catching Izuku off guard. Izuku did not expect an apology from a childhood bully and suspected there might be an ulterior motive. Shoto, sensing Izuku's distrust and feeling guilt, called out for Katsuki and Izumi to come forward, aware of why Izuku was acting cautiously. He thought that no one would ever regret having bullied him. Shoto tilted his head and explained that he had come alone to apologize for everything he had done. Izuku trembled and demanded to know what he meant, furious and confused. Even though he had been bullied, Izuku rarely swore, and his shock made Shoto flinch. Izuku shouted that he could never forgive Shoto, accusing him, Katsuki, and the green-haired sister of making his life a living hell for 5 years. He closed the distance between them as he recounted what had been done to him. Izuku insisted that Shoto understand what it felt like to be beaten by someone he had once called a friend. He accused Shoto of knowing what it felt like to be bullied by a sibling. Izuku described the emptiness of being neglected by his parents, having to fend for himself, coming home with bandages on his injuries only to be met with silence and indifference. He said he had felt like nothing mattered, like giving up. In a moment of blind rage he struck Shoto, sending him stumbling back. Tears streamed down both their faces. They cried for different reasons, one feeling betrayed and the other filled with remorse. Shoto, rarely a person who raised his voice, shouted that he was sorry, and the sound of it made Izuku step back in surprise. Shoto pleaded that he did not know what had come over him. He confessed that he had wanted someone to understand the life he had lived. He had assumed Izuku was loved and wanted to share his pain by making Izuku experience similar suffering. Izuku had many questions. Shoto explained that he had developed his quirk at 4 years old and revealed that his father was the number 2 pro hero, Endeavor. He admitted he was the product of a quirk marriage, a union arranged to produce the perfect heir, and that his father had pursued that ideal relentlessly. Izuku, irritated but not at Shoto, indicated that he understood what a quirk marriage was. Shoto continued that his father had tried for the perfect successor before him, and that his abilities ice on the right and fire on the left were the result of that pressure. After Shoto manifested his quirk, his father isolated him from the rest of the family. His sister had gone abroad to study, his older brothers had left, and one brother, Tuya, had disappeared 2 years earlier. Izuku reacted with disbelief. The boy before him had suffered so much at such a young age. Shoto described how his father forced harsh training that felt like abuse, while his mother did her best to protect him and pushed for him to be allowed to attend school. He recalled overhearing his mother on the phone describing his left side as unsightly and saying he looked too much like his father. When he confronted her, she recoiled and, in a cruel moment, scalded his left side, leaving a burn scar that he touched now as he spoke. Izuku stood still, a whirlwind of emotions crossing his face: anger, sadness, guilt, and regret, but above all he felt overwhelming sorrow. Kinship. Shoto confessed that after his father beat his mother and had her admitted to a mental hospital, he had never had the courage to apologize to her. He admitted that he had been a cruel person, acting like his father toward others, and he was sorry for the way he had treated Izuku. Izuku asked what made Shoto stop bullying him. Shoto explained that he had changed when Izuku was pronounced quirkless and suddenly avoided by everyone, ignored by his parents. Seeing Izuku isolated at school and neglected at home reminded Shoto of what his father had done to his own family, and he could not continue. Senbenzakura confirmed that this was the truth. Izuku forgave Shoto, surprising him. Shoto could not understand why he deserved forgiveness after making Izuku's life so difficult. Izuku gave a dry chuckle and admitted that, despite everything, he and Shoto were alike and that he felt a kinship with him. Izuku then said that forgiveness would come with a request. He wanted Shoto to visit his mother. Shoto admitted quietly that he believed his mother hated him. Izuku responded that Shoto would not know until he tried, and offered to go with him. When Shoto realized Izuku's offer was sincere, he broke down and fell to his knees. Izuku stepped forward, wrapped his arms around Shoto, and held him. Izuku forgave him again, and Shoto thanked him. They left the park together, both relieved and a little lighter than before. Senbenzakura watched them for a moment before looking up at the sky, thinking that Shoto was no longer alone. A father never forgets. 3 years passed. Izuku and Shoto grew closer, their relationship deepening into something like brotherhood, and that closeness unsettled others, especially Katsuki and Izumi, who had feelings for Izuku. Shoto withdrew from them completely. On one occasion he used his quirk to freeze them in place and delivered a harsh, chilling condemnation that made it clear he would not tolerate cruelty. After that, Katsuki and Izumi kept their distance. Izuku and Shoto behaved more like brothers than old friends. Shoto introduced Izuku to his mother, Rei Todoroki. Because Shoto could not visit the hospital alone, Izuku accompanied him every time. After a few visits, Shoto had told Rei about Izuku's past. Rei was furious that anyone could have treated Izuku so badly, and from then on she showed him steady, protective kindness. The first time Izuku heard her speak to him as part of the family, she almost burst into tears. One morning, Rei was about to answer Shoto when Izuku entered the room carrying a basket of fruit and greeted her cheerfully, forgetting his own embarrassment. Shoto choked back a laugh while Rei's tears began to fall. Realizing what had happened, Izuku panicked and bowed repeatedly, apologizing profusely. Rei cut him off with a smile and explained that she was not crying for the reason he feared. She was crying because she was happy to have both of her sons visiting regularly. Izuku, stunned and moved by being accepted as family, began to cry as well. Shoto smiled, seeing how much this meant to them both. Shoto gently nudged Izuku toward their mother, and Rei leaned forward to wrap her pale, slender arms around them both. She promised that once she was well enough to leave the hospital, they would travel and see the world together, her lifelong dream, which had been lost when she had been forced into a marriage with Enji. Izuku vowed that he would get her out of the hospital and away from Enji's influence, even if it cost him his own dream. Rei appreciated the promise, despite her worry for him. Shoto glanced at his watch and said they had to leave before Enji became angry at him for staying out too late. Izuku's eyes filled with tears at hearing Rei call him family, and with a bright, determined smile, he referred to Shoto as his older brother. He waved and hurried off with Shoto, missing the quiet, grateful smile on Rei's face. It had been 3 years since Izuku had been welcomed into this new family, and he had thrown himself into training to protect them. Under Senbenzakura's guidance, Izuku honed his swordsmanship and trained his spiritual energies, his Ryatsu and Ryuryoku, and his progress impressed his mentor, who called him a prodigy. Lately, however, Izuku had been sensing something unfamiliar, a subtle unease that he could not yet name. It felt as if someone was watching him, the same way he had felt years ago. Izuku had been walking home with his brother, who had gone to Enji's house. Now he was alone with Senbenzakura. Izuku suggested to Senbenzakura that they stop by the safe haven. It had been a while since he had been there. Senbenzakura hummed in agreement. They walked toward where it had all started, unaware of the surprise that awaited them. The moment Izuku stepped into the clearing, he sensed that something was wrong. He manifested Senbenzakura in its sealed katana state and gripped it tightly as his senses went on high alert. A distant sound from above reached him, like a blade slicing through the air. He squinted and listened more closely. A figure dropped where Izuku had just stood, landing with enough force to leave a small crater. Instinct made Izuku jump back as the ground beneath him began to rumble. A blinding burst of white light erupted from the earth, and he avoided it by a hair. A slash came from his right and he spun to block an attack aimed at his chest. He shoved the attacker back and planted his feet, katana held before him in a firm, guarded stance. One fatal mistake could cost him everything. The person before him was a man with short, silver curly hair and a black masquerade mask trimmed in silver. He wore formal clothing that seemed oddly out of place for combat, a black suit with a white shirt and an icy blue tie. He held a rapier upright, blade pointed to the sky, steady and ready. His left hand remained tucked behind his back. The rapier's sweeping hilt was icy blue with silver lining, and its silver blade caught the light like a small moon. Izuku demanded to know who the man was and what reason he had for attacking. The man advanced slowly, one hand on the rapier, the other behind him. In a flash of light he appeared directly in front of Izuku, leaned down, and uttered the phrase Moon Fong, "Pierce the heavens." The next flash of light left Izuku reeling. He felt a flurry of precise strikes across his body, each one jolting him and leaving him breathless. He gasped and struggled to stay upright. Izuku asked why the man had attacked. The man spoke in a voice that struck an ache of familiarity and asked whether the name Midoriya rang any bells. Izuku could not make sense of it and could not remember any connection to that name. The man chuckled, shaking his head as if amused that Izuku did not recognize what the man presumed should be known. He wondered aloud whether someone close to Izuku had even told him about her first husband. The man then asked whether the phrase "let the moon light your path" meant anything to Izuku. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, the strikes still throbbed, but he needed to learn who stood before him. He opened his eyes and said that he remembered the phrase but not who had said it, adding dryly that he would remember much better if the attacker had not struck him so abruptly. The man shook his head again, disappointed but not surprised that someone who had suffered so much could not recall events from more than a decade ago. His rapier vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Dizziness began to creep in and Izuku's vision started to darken. He watched the man reach for his mask as if preparing to remove it. Summoning what consciousness he had left, Izuku willed himself to stay awake so he could learn this stranger's identity. The man told Izuku that he might have forgotten, then removed his mask. As the mask dissolved away, the face beneath felt painfully, impossibly familiar. The man was in his early 30s, with silver hair and icy blue eyes, and a calm handsomeness that brought a warmth of safety to Izuku. The man reminded him that a father never forgets. Rebirth Hisashi Kuchiki. Izuku blinked awake and wondered where he was. He realized he was in an opulent room, richly decorated like a royal chamber, with antique furniture that spoke of wealth. He understood, with a start, that this was someone else's room and that the person who had attacked him was nowhere to be seen. He noticed his clothing was not what he remembered wearing and moved to a nearby mirror to take stock. The full-length mirror was rimmed in gold and reflected a version of himself that looked healed and stronger than before. Izuku was startled by the sound of polite applause and spun to see a silver-haired man leaning against the doorframe, clapping with an amused expression. Izuku demanded in his mind to know who the man was and where he was, fingers twitching instinctively as he reached for his companion. The silver-haired man commented that Izuku looked like someone who had been through a great deal and compared his hardened gaze to that of a war veteran. He examined the faded scars and burn marks on Izuku's body and noted the boy's hardened eyes, as if instincts had suddenly sharpened. The man apologized for his distraction with a polite bow and a warm smile that Izuku nonetheless regarded warily. Izuku ordered him to speak. The man observed that Izuku was not given to idle talk and decided to be direct. He claimed that he had been the one who had attacked Izuku in the clearing and then announced that he was Izuku's biological father. Izuku reacted with anger and refused to accept the claim. The man acknowledged the vulgar response but insisted on his identity, saying he had proof that lay within Izuku's mind and soul. Before Izuku could respond, his sword spirit materialized in a humanoid form beside him. The spirit remarked that while Izuku was intelligent for his age, he did not have much patience for riddles. Izuku glared at his companion, and then listened as the spirit suggested that the man meant himself when he spoke of the answer lying within the boy's mind and soul. Izuku asked the spirit to clarify. The spirit sighed and then told him the truth. The silver-haired man was indeed his biological father. The man introduced himself with a flourish, offering many names. He said he sometimes went by Moonfang, Hisashi Midoriya, and more commonly Hisashi Kuchiki. Izuku stared in disbelief, then found himself unable to hold back a dry, surprised thought that the man seemed to share his sense of humor. Izuku steadied himself and demanded explanations. He wanted to know everything: why his surname matched his mother's in one way but not another, why the Kuchiki name appeared in his father's introduction, how his sword spirit fit into all of this, and why the man would abandon him to suffer neglect and mistreatment at home. Hisashi's expression softened with regret and a sincere smile as he said he would tell Izuku everything, but first invited him to freshen up. Izuku hesitated only a moment before nodding. Hisashi left the room, promising to return when Izuku was ready. Later, Hisashi sat in a chair with a glass of wine while an older but vigorous butler stood nearby. The butler expressed concern that revealing the young man's heritage at such a young age might not be safe, and Hisashi assured him that he knew what he was doing. He appointed the butler, Vladimir, to oversee Izuku's training for the near future. Vladimir accepted the duty with theatrical devotion, and Hisashi dismissed him for the day. A woman in long white robes stepped out of the shadows and questioned the decision, echoing Vladimir's concern. She had a luminous complexion, pale lavender hair, and eyes as light as moonlight. Her hands were hidden in the sleeves of her robe, and she moved with quiet grace. Hisashi greeted her cheerfully and reported that his son had been a challenge but only slightly inexperienced. He warned her to prepare for more confrontations with Izuku and the Thousand Cherry Blossom spirit. The woman bowed and vanished in a flash of white light. Hisashi stood and gazed at the moon through a large window, the moonlight casting a cold gleam across his face. His expression grew hard and intent as he thought of those he held responsible for the pain in his past. In a sudden motion, he crushed the glass in his hand, shattering it. He ignored the consequences and let his resolve harden, promising in silence that he would do everything in his power to make those he blamed confront the nightmares he had endured. Hisashi vowed to expose the blonde man, to destroy Inko's daughter's reputation, and to make Inko suffer. He opened his palms and let the crumbled glass fall to the floor. He turned and left with silver hair flowing behind him. The wound on his hand healed itself as he moved. He paused beneath the moonlight, which kept most of his face in shadow and left only his eyes visible, shining silver with rage. A sudden surge of pressure sent the nearby windows shattering into dust in an almost theatrical display. Hisashi warned that her life would crumble like the broken glass and told Inko to beware All Might, Izumi, and the Kuchiki family, declaring he would make them fear his name. Then he walked away, his threat lingering in the night air. Hisashi Kuchiki sat on a couch across from Izuku, a coffee table between them, and asked if Izuku was ready for the answers. Izuku rolled his eyes and replied sarcastically that he was really here to discuss why Karens exist. Hisashi chuckled at the remark. After a short pause, Hisashi stood and poured himself a glass of red wine from an expensive bottle, then asked if Izuku had ever heard of a phoenix. Izuku interrupted with the single word rebirth, and Hisashi nodded, settling back as he sipped the wine with visible pleasure. Izuku commented that Hisashi really liked wine, and Hisashi ignored him. Hisashi explained that phoenixes are known to be reborn after death and said they would get back to that later. He then prepared to tell the story of why he had left Izuku and Inko, speaking Inko's name with such venom that it made Izuku flinch. Years earlier, a younger Hisashi had stood at the airport and said goodbye to Inko with love in his eyes. He gave Inko a brief, loving kiss and pressed a gentle kiss to Izuku's forehead before leaving. He promised silently that he would return one day and hoped his family would forgive him when the time came. As he entered the airport, his expression hardened and his playful facade vanished. He walked a different route from the others and boarded his private jet. Vladimir, who accompanied him, asked if Hisashi was sure this would make him happy. Hisashi answered that all he cared about was their safety and happiness and reminded Vladimir that this was not a permanent goodbye. Vladimir sighed and accepted it, and Hisashi allowed himself a small smile. Back in the present, Hisashi explained that he had been a wanted man and that many would have paid to see his head. He told Izuku that when he met Izuku's mother, he had fallen in love. She had been a UA student while he attended Shiketsu. Hisashi had wanted to be a hero, but after meeting Inko he decided she should pursue that path. Izuku asked what Hisashi meant by hero, and Hisashi revealed that Inko had become the 14th ranked hero, known as Psywave. He further explained that the man named Toshinori Yagi was, in fact, All Might, and Izuku said that the revelation made sense. Izuku bowed his head and asked why Hisashi had never visited. Hisashi felt a pang of guilt, stood, and walked to his son. He embraced Izuku despite Izuku's initial stiffness and flinch. Hisashi apologized, explaining that he could not visit because he had many enemies and the risk to Izuku would have been unacceptable. He vowed that now they were together again as a family, he would not let go of the only biological family he had. Izuku looked up and returned the hug. Izuku thanked him and called him dad, and Hisashi's eyes widened before he smiled, tears gathering at the corners. Izuku then explained that he would accept the apology only if Hisashi agreed to fulfill 3 conditions. Hisashi, confused, asked if they were favors. Izuku answered that they were conditions he had set. Hisashi instructed Vladimir to prepare rooms, and Vladimir bowed and left to take care of it. Hisashi reminded Izuku about their earlier conversation regarding the phoenix. He then walked toward Izuku, bent to take his hand, and told Izuku that, in a symbolic way, today he had died and been born again. Hisashi placed a simple silver ring with the Kuchiki insignia on Izuku's finger and explained that only a Kuchiki or someone recognized by the head of the Kuchiki family could wear it, and that it marked Izuku as a Kuchiki. Hisashi told Izuku that, like the phoenix of legend, he had been reborn. The evening closed on that quiet, solemn promise of new beginnings. Hisashi asked rhetorically about the conditions, and Izuku nodded. Hisashi adopted a thoughtful, formal tone and asked what the conditions were. Izuku suspected he had switched into business mode. Izuku asked whether Hisashi was more influential and wealthier than Endeavor, also known as Enji Todoroki. Hisashi confirmed that he was. Izuku then explained his first condition. He wanted Shoto Todoroki and Rei Todoroki freed. He told Hisashi that since meeting Sen he had felt watched, and now that he had met Hisashi he recognized him as the same person who had looked after him when he was little. Seeing the shock on Hisashi's face, Izuku clarified his suspicion. Hisashi agreed to handle the matter. He said he would personally visit to secure Rei's release, since his presence would deter any of Enji's spies from reporting it. As for Shoto, Hisashi explained that Shoto might have to remain with Endeavor for perhaps a week, a month at worst. Izuku pressed for clarification about the worst-case scenario. Hisashi sighed and admitted he had intended to tell Izuku about his family plans later, once Izuku had settled in. He explained that the plan was to groom Izuku to become the next heir of the Kuchiki family, and that this current situation complicated things. He described how the Yaoyorozu family was attempting to overtake their business. Ordinarily, the Kuchiki resources would far outmatch the Yaoyorozu, but the Yaoyorozu had developed a secret advantage. Hisashi revealed that the Yaoyorozu family's secret weapon was their daughter. He had not expected a person to be used that way. He told Izuku that the head of Yaoyorozu Corp had once been his friend and that they had a falling out. Instead of pushing each other forward, they were now trying to overtake one another. Izuku understood the rivalry but asked how a daughter could be a weapon. Hisashi explained that the daughter, Momo, possessed a powerful quirk called creation. It allowed her to create matter from nothing by converting lipids in her body. To form equipment, she had to know its exact structure, and larger, denser objects required more energy from her. In theory, she could form raw material in her hands. Izuku was astonished. Such a quirk could be devastating in the wrong hands. Hisashi then clarified how he knew so much. Before their falling out, he and Haruto Momo's father had been close friends. He had been at Haruto and Samui's wedding, had held Momo when she was born, and had been honored to be her godfather. Those were days he missed. Izuku absorbed the history and then moved on to his next condition. He asked Hisashi to teach him and his brother Shoto everything that would help them on the path to becoming heroes. Izuku's determination and the fierce light in his eyes reminded Hisashi of his own younger, more innocent self. Hisashi agreed. He arranged for their training. Vlad would oversee combat instruction while Hisashi would teach what he could. He added that Vlad was a retired war veteran who had taken part in the Quirk War that occurred 65 years earlier, and he spoke of the solemn losses the world had suffered during that conflict. Hisashi also said he would groom Izuku to be the next heir of the family. Izuku protested that he wanted to be a hero, not a businessman. Before Hisashi could reply, Sin appeared and lightly bonked Izuku on the head, scolding him to be quiet. Izuku clutched the forming bump while Hisashi watched, unsure whether to laugh or be concerned. Sen's form scattered into cherry blossom petals and disappeared. Hisashi told Izuku that no one was asking him to give up his dream of being a full-time hero. He would remain a hero while handling family responsibilities on designated days. He would not have to shoulder everything alone. Izuku said he understood, somewhat, and Hisashi chuckled and suggested they would discuss the details later. When Izuku admitted he had no third condition and had only said there were 3 because it sounded better, Hisashi accepted the answer with an amused expression. Sin rubbed his temple and murmured that the conversation strained his brain. They agreed to end the discussion for the night. Izuku checked the time, stretched, and prepared for bed. Hisashi quietly wished his son good night and smiled, already planning for the challenges of the next day. Later, a morning knock woke Izuku. Vladimir entered in a butler's uniform, his white hair swept back and his blue eyes meeting Izuku's green ones. Izuku thought he might have seen a brief sparkle in Vladimir's gaze as Vladimir addressed him with respectful formality. A servant entered the room and apologized for waking Izuku, explaining that it was breakfast time and Lord Hisashi had much to discuss. Izuku, embarrassed, told the servant that he could just call him Izuku Vlad and that there was no need for formalities. The servant replied politely and then urged Izuku to freshen up because his father could be impatient. Izuku nodded and went to the bathroom while the servant closed the door behind him. In the bathroom, Sin appeared behind Izuku and asked about his plans for the day. Izuku shrugged and said he planned to visit his mother and Shoto, then wondered aloud whether his parents, Inko and Toshinori, would notice his absence. Sin asked whether Izuku would prefer them to notice, and Izuku admitted he did not know. Part of him hoped they would forget, because it would be easier, but another part longed for a complete family. A sibling who would tease and help him, a mother who would worry and care, and a father who would train him toward becoming a hero. He confessed to Sin that he did not know which he wanted more. Down in the dining area, Hisashi greeted Izuku without taking his eyes off his breakfast, and Izuku returned the greeting with a roll of his eyes before sitting across from his father at a long table. The breakfast spread included waffles, scrambled eggs, bacon, and juice. Izuku praised the food exuberantly, delighted by the taste. Hisashi looked puzzled when Izuku asked who had made it. Izuku admitted the waffles and bacon were store-bought, but he enjoyed them nonetheless and continued eating with enthusiasm. Hisashi flinched at Izuku's sudden loud praise, and the tension was enough to crack a glass on the table. Hisashi gave a small, embarrassed apology, and the maid carefully removed the broken glass. Hisashi asked about Izuku's plans for the day. Izuku said he intended to visit his mother and Shoto, and Hisashi brightened and expressed that it was the perfect idea. At the hospital, Rei sat on her bed looking out the window while Shoto paced anxiously. Izuku had not arrived yet, and Rei worried that something might have happened to him. Shoto stopped pacing and raised his guard when he heard voices approaching. Enji had arranged for Rei to be isolated during her hospital stay, and both siblings tensed at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps and voices. They listened as playful banter passed just outside the door, and then Izuku appeared and told them to wait for him to call before coming in so they would not be bombarded with questions. The door slid open and Izuku entered carrying a bouquet of white flowers. He offered a polite greeting to his mother and to Shoto. Shoto nodded and Rei smiled, asking if Izuku had encountered any trouble on his way. Izuku waved her concern away, saying he was fine and that he had someone to introduce. Izuku invited the person in, and a formally dressed, handsome man with silver hair and ice-blue eyes entered and bowed briefly. He introduced himself as Izuku Kuchiki. Rei reacted with surprise at the name and the man's presence, taken aback by the appearance of such a prominent figure arriving with Izuku. Rei asked Izuku in an accusing tone whether he had done something, and Izuku quickly denied it. Hisashi addressed Shoto and then turned to Rei, complimenting her appearance with sincere gratitude for caring for Izuku. He performed a courteous bow and took her hand in a brief, respectful gesture before releasing it. Rei blushed at the kindness. Shoto and Izuku noticed the exchange, and Hisashi stepped back with a small, pleased smile. Hisashi explained that he was the head of the Kuchiki family and the father of Izuku, and he offered a polite remark about being pleased to meet them. Family. Promise. Rei reacted in shock when she recognized Hisashi Kuchiki and realized he was Izuku's father. Her mouth dropped open. Shoto, who had also lost his usual serious expression, widened his eyes at the revelation. Hisashi Kuchiki, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Japan, stood in front of the two Todorokis and claimed to be Izuku's father. Rei looked between father and son, searching Izuku's face for confirmation. Up close she could see that Izuku had inherited most of his features from Hisashi, the freckles, the face shape, and the curly hair. Shoto spoke on their behalf, asking if it was true. Izuku nodded and confirmed that everything Hisashi had said was accurate. Rei demanded to know how they had met. Hisashi looked sheepish and rubbed the back of his head. Izuku smirked, anticipating the scolding his father was about to receive. Rei glared at Hisashi, and Shoto, unable to process Izuku's limits any longer, simply sat down and began eating an apple. Rei asked whether Hisashi thought it appropriate to introduce himself to his son by attacking him and leaving him badly injured. Hisashi stuttered an affirmative reply. Seeing him falter, Rei adopted what Izuku and Shoto called Mama Bear mode. She stepped toward Hisashi and placed her hand on his chest. At first he appeared confused and flushed, but the redness faded as Rei used her quirk to chill him. She produced a thin, almost invisible layer of ice across his torso, controlling the temperature precisely so that it would immobilize him without causing harm. Rei warned that he was lucky Izuku had been healed, or she would have fully immobilized him. Izuku and Shoto edged into a corner, not wanting to be in the path of Rei's temper. Rei called to Shoto and asked him to remove the ice. Shoto stiffened, then quickly moved to melt the ice, reluctant to use his power but unwilling to disappoint his mother or brother. As Shoto worked, Rei beckoned Izuku over and gave him a firm bonk on the head that left a visible bump. Izuku complained about being hit on the head, and Rei scolded him for fighting someone as strong as Hisashi. If Hisashi had been a villain instead of his father, Izuku could have been killed. Izuku apologized, guilt written across his face. Rei shook her head and said that the boys worried her too much. Hisashi watched the scene with a calm, almost serene smile. He called Izuku over and asked if Izuku could retrieve some papers from his car, explaining they were needed for a particular purpose. He tossed his car keys to Izuku, who left the room with a joyful expression that neither Rei nor Shoto understood. After a brief, awkward silence, Rei attempted to speak, but Hisashi interrupted with a bow and words of gratitude. He thanked Rei and Shoto for looking after Izuku, for giving him a mother and siblings' love, for providing a place to announce his return, and for offering Izuku people to bond with and call family. Hisashi expressed deep appreciation from the bottom of his heart. Shoto responded that they should not be thanked and that they were the ones grateful. Izuku had brought his mother back into his life and given them a chance to be reunited. Rei agreed, insisting that Hisashi need not feel obligated, and that Izuku was his son regardless of biology. She was proud to call him family. Izuku returned with a folder, oblivious to the mood in the room. Hisashi thanked him as he accepted the papers, then remarked that it was time to go. Izuku glanced at the hospital clock, nodded, hugged his mother, and exchanged a fist bump with Shoto before leaving. Before departing, Hisashi offered the folder to Rei as a favor to his son and, in a brief, respectful gesture of thanks, lightly touched her hand. Rei found herself momentarily flustered. He shook Shoto's hand and asked the boy to continue looking after Izuku, insisting that he simply be called Hisashi, not sir, with a chuckle to ease the formality. As he prepared to leave, Hisashi told Rei she had a week at most to prepare. Rei opened the folder and quickly read through its contents. She let out a scream, though it was unclear whether it came from joy or anger. Those who heard it did not know. Hisashi stared at his hand, formed a fist and clenched it tightly. He thought angrily that every single one of the heroes in this world seemed corrupt. He vowed to save Shoto Todoroki, and with his keen eyes he noticed the bruises the half-and-half-haired boy had tried to hide. He did not miss the wince of pain or the burn marks near the boy's neck. He resolved that Enji would be dealt with first, as a prelude to confronting the greater threat. It had been a week since Hisashi had met Rei and Shoto. He had prepared for Rei's release from the hospital and for Shoto's custody. Now he was on to phase 2 of the plan. Hisashi asked Vlad if Izuku was asleep. Vlad bowed and replied that the young lord was still asleep, having trained until he dropped, which Vlad declared with dramatic admiration for the boy's thirst for strength. Hisashi asked Vlad to keep an eye on him and to take him to the training ground when he woke. Vlad accepted the responsibility and asked, humbly, where Hisashi was going. Hisashi said he had matters to deal with and that he would be back before lunch. Then he waved and left. He sat in his car and drove, thinking about Rei and whether she was ready to leave the hospital and begin a new life with her son, both of them free from the demon that had haunted them. He knew his confrontation with that demon was imminent. Shoto was alone when Izumi and Bakugo appeared. Shoto noticed Izumi's green eyes and the blush on her face and heard the growl that escaped Katsuki. He was aware of Izumi's crush on him and of Katsuki's feelings for Izumi. He planned, coldly, to make Katsuki suffer for the harm Katsuki had caused his older brother by provoking him and pushing his buttons rather than because he cared for Izumi. He told himself he hated her and that making Katsuki miserable would be a fitting retribution. Izumi stammered, asking Shoto if he knew where Izuku was. Shoto suspected their motives and thought they might want to hurt Izuku. Katsuki demanded an answer and insulted Shoto, calling him by a mocking nickname. Shoto ignored Katsuki and kept his eyes locked on Izumi. She trembled under Shoto's venomous gaze and could not answer. A wave of guilt coursed through her when she thought of Izuku's disappearance. She remembered that she had once intended to stop her brother from becoming a hero but had become intoxicated by having control over someone's fate. Katsuki then leapt at Shoto with the intention of attacking him. Izumi tried to stop him, but her plea failed to reach him. Katsuki launched a powerful explosion aimed at Shoto. Smoke filled the area and briefly obscured the scene. Izumi gasped and dropped to her knees as the smoke cleared. Shoto stood behind a half-dome of ice, glaring at Katsuki with such malice that even Katsuki, who would never admit it, felt fear. Shoto warned him never to do that again, and Katsuki shuddered and nodded in dumb compliance. Shoto left them then, leaving ice traces with every step. Once he was sure he was far away, he punched a wall in frustration, leaving a scorch mark in the shape of a fist. He calmed himself and walked home. School had already ended, so he would not be in trouble with his father. Enji had had a rough day. interrupted by a would-be villain on his day off. He had taken his anger out on the intruder and was headed home thinking about ways to make Shoto stronger and to shape him into the #1 hero. When he unlocked the door and stepped inside, a chill ran down his spine. The house was dimly lit and there was light and sound coming from the living room. Assuming Shoto had returned early and annoyed that his son might be skipping, Enji marched into the living room. There he found a man with silver hair and moon-reflecting eyes sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in hand. The man turned to look at Enji and, smiling with an expression that mixed charm and contained rage, addressed him as #2. Enji took a step back, composed himself, and prepared to question the stranger, but the man greeted him with that same bright, dangerous smile. Enji Todoroki, known as Endeavor, stepped back in disbelief when his intruder addressed him as #2. He wondered whether the man knew whose house he had broken into, but decided it did not matter. Endeavor demanded to know who the intruder was and whether he understood whose house he was in. Hisashi Kuchiki laughed and praised Endeavor's greatness, causing Endeavor to smirk at the compliment despite his alarm. Endeavor introduced himself formally as Enji Todoroki, Pro Hero Endeavor, currently ranked #2 in Japan and 27th worldwide, boasting a record of captured villains greater than the fabled All Might. He added a bitter aside about his reputation for harsh personal conduct, then lunged at the intruder, declaring the man under arrest for breaking and entering. Hisashi merely chuckled, vanished from Endeavor's sight, and Endeavor, caught off guard, accidentally scorched the couch. Hisashi whistled and remarked that the burn would leave a mark. Endeavor spun back, furious and puzzled at how the intruder had dodged him and ended up behind him. Hisashi explained that Endeavor's attacks were straightforward and easy to read, and that his speed was simply too much for Endeavor's eyes to perceive. Enji demanded identification. Hisashi sat calmly, unbothered by Endeavor's glare, and sipped the intact glass of wine in his hand. He offered an introduction, acknowledging that he had technically broken into the house. Hisashi stated that his name was Hisashi Kuchiki, head of the 7-generation-old Kuchiki clan. He said he was the third richest man in the world and wielded significant influence over Japan's government, especially the Civil Council, which encompassed the president and prime minister. He paused to allow Endeavor to absorb the information. Enji was stunned to realize he stood before the reclusive head of the Kuchiki family. He understood he could not afford a public fight with a man who could destroy his career. He forced himself into a civil tone and asked what the famous clan head wanted with him. Hisashi grew serious and said he would not beat around the bush. When Endeavor pressed for clarity, naming Rei and asking what Hisashi wanted with her, Hisashi revealed that he had consulted experienced, trusted doctors who had performed multiple psychological evaluations on Rei. The doctors had cleared her and found her mentally well. Hisashi said that copies of the results were on the kitchen counter as proof. Enji snatched the papers from the counter, furious and disbelieving, and read them thoroughly before almost burning them in anger. The documents stated that Rei Todoroki had been cleared of mental health issues and was free to leave the hospital. Hisashi handed another set of papers to Endeavor and explained that they were divorce documents that Rei had already signed, suggesting Endeavor sign them as well. Enji immediately burned those papers with a smirk. Hisashi anticipated that reaction and pressed more divorce papers into Enji's chest with a smile, saying he had prepared additional copies if necessary. Enji grumbled that the woman had to pay for hurting what he considered his masterpiece and accused her of seducing him. Hisashi dismissed the accusation calmly, acknowledging that Rei was beautiful but admonishing Endeavor for treating her poorly and letting her go. Endeavor glared and, under pressure, signed the divorce papers. He muttered that he no longer had to be bound to her, but was interrupted when Hisashi pushed yet another set of papers forward. Hisashi tried to coax Endeavor into a lighter mood, telling him not to brood and to stop obsessing over reaching #1. Endeavor, wanting the confrontation to end, asked if that was all. Hisashi then grew cold and serious as he spoke about Shoto. When Endeavor demanded to know what Hisashi wanted with the boy, the temperature in the room felt to him like it dropped. The previously easygoing clan had adopted a stern, commanding presence. Hisashi warned that on the day of the court hearing, Rei would be granted custody of Shoto. He made it clear that if Endeavor tried to prevent this outcome, Hisashi would destroy his career and no one would be able to stop him. He stated firmly that he always got what he wanted and that he intended for the boy to be free. Enji took a step back, shaken by the intensity of Hisashi's declaration. A chill ran through him at the threat. Hisashi turned to leave and reminded Endeavor that their conversation mattered. The next step Endeavor took would determine his fate. Hisashi told Enji that he could either let go of his weapon and lead a respectful life, or cling to it and end up losing the weapon along with his dignity and fame, and that after his decision he would amount to nothing to him. Hisashi walked out without looking back at Enji's cowering figure. On the way out, Hisashi encountered Shoto. Hisashi greeted Shoto and asked how he was. Shoto looked confused as he started to address Hisashi formally, but Hisashi interrupted and told him to drop the formalities and to call him Hisashi. Shoto obliged awkwardly. Hisashi explained that he had only been there for a chat and that Shoto need not worry. When Shoto prepared to leave, Hisashi put a comforting hand on his head and told him to hang in there for just a little longer. Shoto turned to look back, but found no one there and wondered what a strange man Hisashi had been. All Might intervened when a villain with a water-based quirk had just robbed a bank. All Might unleashed a powerful blast of air that knocked the villain back, and the citizens of Hosu cheered at the arrival of the #1 hero. All Might offered a brief smile to the crowd, then announced that he had to leave because evil never rested, and he leapt into the air. He landed atop an abandoned building in Mizudafu. Smoke trailed from him and he coughed and staggered, clearly weakened from the fight. For a few hours he carried the mantle of the #1 hero. For the rest of the day he was Toshinori Yagi, an ordinary salesman and a father. Toshinori had a skeletal appearance, with sunken eyes and a bony frame. The hopeful smile he used as All Might had given way to a tired, grim expression that betrayed his exhaustion. Toshinori worried that something strange was happening with One for All. He could almost only access up to 70% of its power, and instead of his usual 6 hours as the hero, he managed only about 4 to 4.5 if he pushed himself. He wondered if his health was deteriorating that quickly and how long he had left as All Might. He resolved that he needed a successor, and he thought of someone who lived in his home, his Izumi, who in a year would be able to inherit One for All. The thought of his master meeting Izumi made him smile. He imagined Nana would have been proud. A buzzing sound interrupted his thoughts. In his mind's eye he saw a determined young hero in a green suit with green hair. The youth's eyes narrowed with resolve and a comforting smile remained even through hardship. The vision shifted and the young hero appeared battered, his suit torn and himself exhausted, but still smiling as he insisted that everything would be fine because a hero was there. The youth vowed to risk his life to save others and to become the kind of hero who could save everyone within his reach, even vowing to surpass the example he admired. A buzzing sound came again, and Toshinori found himself standing in darkness. He turned and met a version of himself, a copy with black hair instead of blonde, red eyes instead of blue, and a malicious grin where his tired expression should have been. As Toshinori tried to power up, he found himself unexpectedly unable to do so. The copy laughed, and a hand rested on Toshinori's shoulder. The copy leaned in and told him that it was him. When Toshinori turned, 7 figures looked back at him, several shrouded in shadow. Among them, Toshinori saw Nana Shimura. The image of his old master accusing him struck him deeply. Nana told him that she regretted giving him One for All and blamed him for losing the perfect successor, declaring that his actions had doomed that person to a life of misery and were the kind of thing villains would do. Toshinori felt his heart break at those words and struggled to understand how Nana, whom he had loved and respected as a teacher and mother figure, could say such things. Though Toshinori did not fully understand the pain in Nana's words, the vision made it clear that for her the betrayal had been profound. The student she had taught and cared for had neglected someone close and, in her eyes, tainted the lineage of One for All. A raspy voice added condemnation. A man with white hair and red eyes glared at Toshinori and declared that he would punish him, saying that Toshinori and his successor would be punished until they had redeemed themselves. A deep, authoritative voice declared that entry to the plane of origin would not be granted until redemption was achieved, and with nothing more to say the voice sent Toshinori toward unconsciousness. Before he blacked out, he caught a glimpse of a boy with green hair and green eyes smiling at him. Toshinori woke groggy on his own bed and wondered how he had gotten there. The door opened and Izuku Yagi appeared at the doorway. She noted that he had come straight to their room and collapsed onto the bed and asked if he had had a stressful day. Toshinori answered that it had been something like that. Inko smiled and told him to freshen up while she prepared katsudon, leaving him alone. Toshinori tried to shake off the feeling of the green-haired boy. He stood and stretched and told himself it had all been a dream. He checked his reflection in a full-length mirror on the wall. When his fist struck the glass, the mirror shattered with a sudden, painful sting in his hand. The broken shards caught the light and reflected the image of a shadowy, black-haired man with menacing red eyes. The pain in Toshinori's hand made him wince. Inko called from the kitchen to ask if he was all right. Toshinori forced himself to believe it had all been a dream. Izuku bounded into the room and tackled Rei into a hug, and Rei returned the embrace with warmth. Hisashi watched them with an easy expression as Rei told Izuku she hoped he was doing well, and Izuku nodded. Rei then approached Hisashi and expressed gratitude for what he had done for her. Hisashi told her there was no need to bow and that he had acted in the best interest of his son. He explained that Izuku's bright smile had been brought out by Rei and Shoto, and then he bowed and asked Rei to call him Hisashi, causing her to blush. Rei stumbled over her reply at first but agreed. Izuku quietly observed the exchange. Rei asked after Shoto, and Izuku noted that Shoto should arrive in about an hour. Izuku encouraged Rei to make herself comfortable, then said he needed to go train. Rei worried aloud about training at such a young age, and Izuku reassured her that he could handle it. Hisashi noticed Rei's concern and reassured her that Shoto was in good hands and that Vlad would not hurt him. Rei asked who Vlad was, and Hisashi said Vlad was someone important to him, his face turning nostalgic. He then told Rei they had much to discuss and led her toward his office while the maids carried Rei's things to the guest room. After leaving the mansion, Izuku went looking for Vlad. He thought back to his first meetings with the lively, youthful old man and the fondness that had grown in him. He arrived at the dojo and found it unusually quiet. Sen appeared beside him. Sen asked why Izuku was searching for the gentleman, and Izuku replied that he wanted to train. Sen questioned who had advised Izuku to train with Vlad, and Izuku admitted that Hisashi calling him dad had suggested it. The words still felt foreign but also brought a warm, ecstatic feeling to Izuku. Sen explained that, although Izuku could not sense other people's ryatsu yet, Sen could, and from the moment he had seen Vlad he knew Vlad was strong, far stronger than Izuku's father. Sen said he could teach Izuku theoretical things that required the mind, but Vlad was better suited to teaching physical skills and sword work. When Izuku asked how Sen knew Vlad used a sword, Sen pointed to Vlad's posture, grounded feet, a relaxed but ready body, steady stance, and sharp eye signs that revealed a trained swordsman. Sen added that Vlad shared traits with Izuku and his father and suggested there might be others like them, or there might be only the three of them. In any case, having others did not guarantee that their hearts would be on the side of light. Izuku absorbed Sen's words and accepted the possibility. Sen guided Izuku toward where Vlad was likely to be. After a short walk they stopped at a small, worn workshop. A clear clang of metal on metal came from inside. Izuku pushed the door open a little and peered in with Sen at his side. Inside, Vlad was striking a long piece of metal with a hammer at a forge. Sweat dotted his face from the heat, and his usual formal attire had been exchanged for a black tank top and cargo pants. His hair was tied back in a ponytail, and his icy blue eyes were locked on his work. Every hammer slide was precise, sharp, and purposeful. The heat from the forge made beads of sweat roll down Izuku's face. The heat in the workshop was ignored by Izuku. He was enthralled by the scene before him. Vlad's focus was absolute. Each strike of his hammer was precise and purposeful, aimed at shaping a weapon meant to protect rather than to harm. After molding the metal into shape, he continued the work of refining it. Izuku entered and took a seat on one of the benches, eyes sparkling as he watched a blade emerge from rusty pieces of metal. Vlad noted the arrival of the young lord and wondered if he might have found an apprentice. If Master Hisashi agreed, he could pass on his teachings and gain a successor. When the blade was finished, it sat on the table with a quiet sheen. It was a simple, straight sword, but it captivated Izuku. Senbenzakura watched as his partner and master inspected the sword with awe. Izuku thought the blade perfect and marveled at how someone could create something so remarkable from junk. The process itself had been astonishing to him. Vlad rested his head lightly against Izuku's hair and smiled. Izuku apologized with a bow for entering without permission, and Vlad chuckled that the young lord was always welcome. Izuku noticed a sword sheathed at Vlad's waist and asked what it was for. Vlad then asked Izuku to hold the newly forged blade for him and gave clear instructions to hold it straight and firm. Izuku complied, arms steady. The new sword pointed in the direction of Senbenzakura. Without warning, Vlad unsheathed his own sword and in one fluid, practiced motion split the newly forged blade cleanly in two. Izuku reacted with shock, lamenting the loss of what had been such a beautiful sword. Vlad looked at the halved blade with disappointment, sheathed his weapon, and placed it on a rack among other arms. He watched Izuku gather the fragments, then reached out, ruffled Izuku's hair, and asked in a serious, disciplined tone if he wanted to know why the sword had been cut. Izuku swallowed nervously and nodded. Vlad explained that he had cut the sword as a sacrifice in pursuit of his goal. He described that a Zanpakuto traditionally housed a soul, the primary source of its power, and that blades were artificial vessels for those souls. Vlad believed it might be possible to birth life into a blade by creating an artificial soul, but the process was difficult. It required an enormous amount of spiritual energy poured into the metal while forging and then additional spiritual energy afterward to make the vessel suitable to house a spirit. The amount of energy required was immense, more than any single person normally possessed. Izuku listened, then questioned whether it was truly possible. He suggested that even if an artificial soul could be created, it might remain hollow and lack unique properties. Vlad was surprised by Izuku's insight and explained that he had thought of a way to bypass the hollow soul problem. If someone with a quirk could unlock their spiritual energy, the artificial soul might adapt to that person, taking on properties of the quirk while surpassing it in strength. At that, Vlad fell into a nostalgic, sorrowful expression, bringing a hand near the ring on his finger and revealing that he had promised someone dear to him that he would make a weapon suitable for them. Izuku regarded the normally dramatic man in a different light. He steeled his resolve, looked to Senbenzakura for confirmation, and, receiving a nod, turned back to Vlad with renewed passion. He bowed before Vlad and begged to be taught. Vlad asked what Izuku wanted to learn, and Izuku answered that he wanted to learn everything: how to wield a sword and how to breathe life into one. Vlad warned that his training would be harsh and that he would not be easy on him, mentioning that Izuku's father still regretted asking Vlad to train him. That existence of the elders' past training gave Izuku even more reason to be instructed by Vlad. Izuku insisted he would not back down and pleaded again to be taught. Vlad's demeanor shifted. A faint silver aura like steam seemed to gather around him. The floor beneath him cracked with the intensity of the pressure he exuded, and his icy blue eyes took on a divine silver tint. Izuku faltered to the floor but continued to gaze at Vlad with a mixture of defiance, determination, and fear. The presence felt like a mountain, an enormous challenge that thrilled and terrified him at once. Senbenzakura admitted to himself that the pressure was almost divine. Vlad embodied strength, stronger than his previous owner and only slightly less than the one who had murdered his previous master. Izuku met Vlad's narrowed eyes with unwavering resolve despite his fear and begged once more to be taught. Vlad accepted, and the pressure from Vlad and the raw energy in Izuku met and clashed as the first lesson began. A graceful pink aura enveloped Izuku and clashed with Vlad's cold, silver presence. Izuku could just make out the shadow of a figure standing behind Vlad as the two energies collided. The floor and windows cracked, and the weapons on the rack shattered into fragments under the immense pressure exerted by both Zanpakuto users. Sen dissipated and reformed in Izuku's hands, as if aware that his master would need to confront Vlad to secure Izuku's apprenticeship. Shoto, who had been sipping his tea, reacted in shock and terror and demanded to know what had happened. Beads of sweat rolled down his cheek as a wave of dominant pressure washed over him. Rei, failing to sense anything unusual at first, asked with concern if Shoto was all right. Hisashi, who had been discussing plans with Rei and had invited Shoto to tea, already anticipated the situation. He expected Izuku to ask Vlad to teach him swordsmanship but had not expected Vlad to release such refined spiritual pressure. Vlad's presence was controlled and veteran-like, while Izuku's was raw and untamed. A man dressed in black with a masquerade mask dropped from the shadows, murmured something to Hisashi, and slipped back into darkness. Rei moved to comfort the trembling Shoto, asking again if he was all right. Hisashi rose, asserted that everything was fine, and approached Shoto, laying a calming hand on his shoulder. A pulse of spiritual energy ran through Shoto's body, briefly blurring his form. For a split second another figure in black robes seemed to overlap him before everything snapped back to normal. Hisashi smirked inwardly at the display of raw talent, thinking that he had found 2 diamonds waiting to be polished. He already knew Vlad had agreed to train Izuku, though not in the art of forgery a surprise, but a welcome one. Hisashi suggested that Shoto get some rest, and Rei nodded in agreement. Izuku gripped the hilt of Senbonzakura tightly, prepared to fight if he had to earn Vlad's recognition. Vlad stared at him for a few more seconds, then the refined pressure he had been projecting faded. Izuku exhaled deeply, releasing a breath he had not realized he was holding. Vlad helped Izuku to his feet, then retreated to change into his usual butler attire in a separate room. When he returned, his demeanor had shifted into that of a stoic veteran who had seen far more than most. His eyes hardened with the experience of a seasoned warrior as he agreed to train Izuku, producing a slender sword that resembled a rapier. He held it upright before Izuku, closed his eyes briefly, and opened them again with a solemn promise, invoking his name to seal the vow to make Izuku the best swordsman and blacksmith the world would see. 2 weeks passed since Rei had been released from the hospital. Shoto, Izuku, and Rei spent quality time together, and Izuku had begun training under Vlad. He had discovered a passion for forging and devoted his free time to craftsmanship with Vlad when not practicing sword techniques. Vladimir's training proved brutal in contrast to Sen's strictness. Where Sen was demanding, Vlad was relentless. Izuku was forced to perfect each slash. Vlad would not allow him to move on until a technique was mastered to the smallest detail. Vlad would remind him that he feared not the practitioner who had practiced 10,000 different kicks once, but the one who had practiced the same kick 10,000 times. When Izuku complained about the weights and conditioning, Vlad only responded cryptically that he would see in time. Sen began teaching Izuku about spiritual pressure, or ryatsu, and how to use inner energy in various ways. He educated Izuku on how to work with Sen, explained the moves Izuku could currently use, and described Sen's different forms. Sen also explained the 2 major stages of a Zanpakuto, the Shurikai, which grants access to half of the Zanpakuto's power, and the Bankai, which grants access to most, if not all, of the Zanpakuto's power. Izuku grew closer to his father during this PRD, hearing many stories of past travels and hardships. He also quieted the doubts in his heart about Inko and Toshinori still caring for him. He accepted that, although Inko was his birth mother, the people around him had become his family in different ways. He had found a new family and felt content, even noting the added comfort of having a grandfather figure in his life. Unbeknownst to him, his life was about to become even brighter. A voice yelled through the Kuchiki mansion, drawing everyone's attention. Hisashi stood with a nervous smile while Rei looked guilty. Shoto shouted in disbelief that their mother was getting a divorce and that custody arrangements involved him, demanding to know why no one had told him. Izuku laughed and pointed at Shoto with a mock-betrayed expression, prompting Shoto to accuse Izuku of hiding the news and question what kind of friend and brother he was. Shoto then diverted his gaze toward the fish tank, pretending the fish were more interesting than the conversation. Izuku explained that he had been so focused on his training that he had not had the chance to bring it up. When Shoto asked when the hearing was, Izuku replied that it was that very day, causing Shoto to start a frustrated exclamation before Rei intervened. Rei lightly smacked Izuku on the head and glared, scolding him about his language. Izuku rubbed his head in pain and wondered inwardly why that always seemed to happen to him. Someone quipped that his head was big, and Sen gave no answer. Hisashi, seeing the commotion, apologized to Izuku for the oversight. Hisashi told Izuku to get ready because they would be leaving soon. Izuku looked at his father with confusion and asked if he was really going. Hisashi affirmed that he was. Izuku admitted that he did not have any formal clothes and that he had not taken anything from that house. Hisashi told him to check his closet and, smiling, mentioned that he had a little gift for him, patting his head. Izuku smiled and ran off to change. Shudo watched with a frown as his surrogate brother went upstairs, still feeling guilty about the bullying that had happened. Rei felt a swelling of anger directed at Inko and Toshinori, and at herself. She remembered meeting Inko and Toshinori once when Izuku had been 3 and how kind they had seemed, how they appeared to love Izuku and Izumi wholeheartedly. When Shudo had first told her about Izuku's situation, she had not believed him, but as she got to know Izuku, she had slowly come to accept the truth. She remembered Izuku visiting with bags under his eyes and torn clothes, looking thin and exhausted. Rei pushed those memories aside. Izuku now had a proper family. She had already promised herself she would show Izuku the love he had lacked, and she would not break that promise. Izuku returned wearing a black waistcoat over a white shirt and a black tie, with matching black dress pants and shoes. Rei smiled at him and embraced both Shudo and Izuku tightly, teasing that they both looked so handsome and that she could not wait for grandchildren someday. Izuku and Shudo protested together, embarrassed. Hisashi laughed and urged everyone not to be late. Izuku and Shudo realized why Rei and Shudo had been dressed formally that morning. It was the day of the custody hearing. They left the courthouse in stunned silence. Rei had won custody of Shudo with surprising ease. Enji Todoroki had not fought to retain custody. They had been in and out of the court quickly. Rei expressed disbelief at how simple it had been, and Izuku asked Hisashi if it was really supposed to be that easy. Hisashi chuckled and told Izuku not to worry. He would learn how to intimidate a top hero and a courtroom someday. Rei suddenly began to cry. Izuku ran to comfort his mother, joined by Shudo. Izuku asked why she was crying. Rei, tears on her face, said that the man who had hurt them would no longer be able to harm Shudo or her. Shudo, who had been in denial that it could be so simple, had a sudden realization. He would no longer have to return home from school expecting pain, no longer spend hours enduring abuse or be forced into impossible expectations. Tears fell from Shudo's eyes at the thought of finally being free. Izuku fought the urge to cry. As the older brother, he felt he needed to be strong for Shudo and their mother. He allowed himself to hold them both and to offer comfort while smiling through his own relief. Hisashi watched the scene with a sad, reflective expression, thinking what a cruel world it had been to let things go on as they had. A familiar voice cut through the moment. Enji walked up and dismissed the scene as pitiful. Rei spoke his name calmly. Enji sneered and told Shudo that he had been destined for great things and that he would take Shudo back to make him the #1 hero, addressing Shudo as if he were a tool to be used. Izuku flared with outrage at Enji's words. His energy tightened around Hisashi's hand, a clear sign that he was preparing to manifest his weapon. Hisashi felt concerned but restrained. They were in public and he did not want unnecessary attention. He intended to give Enji a warning and a clear threat, but Enji crossed a line when flames gathered around his fist and he wound his arm back as if to strike. Enji's flames made Hisashi wary about bystanders being caught in the crossfire, and the air around Enji grew cold with tension. A cold hand settled on Enji's shoulder. When he turned, he met Hisashi's ice-blue eyes full of controlled rage that dared him to make the next move. Enji, unnerved, shrugged the hand off and, glaring at Izuku and Rei, left the scene quickly. Hisashi stared after him with fury before turning to help Rei up. Rei surprised him by pulling him into a hug and thanking him. Hisashi, still a little stiff, asked what she meant, and Rei shook her head while holding him, telling him that she knew he had done something to make the custody win possible and that she knew Enji well enough to be sure. A short, calm moment followed as they gathered themselves after the courtroom ordeal. She cried into Hisashi's shoulder, vowing that she would never let Shudo go, refusing to ask what he had done, and thanking him through sobs. Hisashi stood stunned for a second before returning the hug and telling her she was welcome. Shudo watched with tears in his eyes until Izuku stepped forward and pulled him into an embrace. Shudo broke and cried against his surrogate older brother, and Izuku fought back his own tears, determined to be the steady shoulder Shudo needed and to prove he was not alone. Hisashi smiled genuinely and thought he could get used to this. After a few minutes he led them toward the car. Izuku, Shudo, and Rei walked ahead while Hisashi paused, nodded, and motioned with his hand. From his shadow a figure garbed in black and wearing a metallic mask detached itself and emerged. The masked figure acknowledged him and then dissipated into shadow again. Hisashi told the masked figure that he expected certain consequences and that he would enjoy what came next perhaps more than he should, adding that he hoped Enji would set himself straight afterward. Izuku called for Hisashi to hurry, and Hisashi waved before walking toward the car, hiding a thin, sinister smile as he approached the laughing family of three. He would do anything to preserve those smiles. A room buzzed with reporters and camera flashes as a man stood before them. Reporters clamored for answers, asking who had caused his injuries and whether it would affect his career. The man pressed his scarred right hand to his damaged right eye. The eye was blind and marked by a healed injury, and his right hand was missing an index finger. He told the reporters that he did not know if this would affect his career and that he did not know who had caused his suffering, but he called the perpetrator a monster. When more questions followed, he ignored them and left the stage. From his pocket he withdrew a small scrap of paper with a single word written on it, a word that carried more weight than any explanation. He did not speak further. If he valued his remaining eye and fingers, he would never reveal what had happened. The secrets behind the true face of the head of the Kuchiki clan would remain with him, and his dream of being #1 would fade along with them. At the smithy, sweat shone on a young man's defined face as he struck the steel with a hammer in a steady, practiced rhythm. His icy blue eyes narrowed on the blade as if searching for every flaw. His long silver hair, tied in a rough ponytail, swayed with each motion. When the sliding door opened, the man told the visitor to come in his usual monotone. A white-haired youth entered and, glancing around, told him that their father had called a meeting and said he had something to say. The older man did not look away from his work but stopped long enough to register the news. The younger shrugged and urged his friend to go with him. Later, Izuku breathed a relieved sigh at the finished katana. He hovered his hand over the blade and channeled his spirit energy, letting it flow like a thin blanket around the sword. He increased the pressure a little at a time until, with a disappointing crack, the sword split from the middle. He felt the sting of failure and told himself he would succeed one day. His friend Sen offered encouragement, and Izuku wiped his face, drank cold water, untied his hair, and agreed to go see their father. On the walk to the Kuchiki mansion, Izuku thought back over the past 5 years since he, Shuto, and Rei had been freed from their demons. They had all lived together happily under Hisashi's roof, with varying degrees of contentment. Izuku had gained a family, Rei and Hisashi as parents, Shuto as a younger brother, and Vladimir as a grandfather. A high-pitched voice called out, "Zuzu," and brought a rare smile to the normally stoic Kuchiki. Shudo approached carrying a small child, Hoshi, a 3-year-old who would turn 4 soon. The little girl reached out for Izuku. Shudo playfully glared and handed her over, knowing she always preferred Izuku, perhaps because of his long hair. Shudo considered growing his hair out so he could rub it in Izuku's face that little Hoshi liked him more. Izuku adjusted the little girl in his arms and smirked at Shudo. Shudo glared and silently mouthed an insult while motioning for Izuku to wipe the smirk off his face. Izuku feigned confusion and asked if Shudo was sick. Shudo raised his palm as a thin layer of ice began to form and declared that in a year's time he would prove Hoshi loved him more. Izuku tilted his head and kept smiling, teasing that Shudo would need a second quirk to grow hair remotely as beautiful as his. Shudo snapped that they would see who had the last laugh. A tug on his sleeve pulled their attention to Hoshi, who looked up at them on the verge of tears and pleaded for them not to fight. Izuku softened and reassured the little girl that they were only playing and that her older brother was just throwing a tantrum. Shudo gritted his teeth but finally agreed. Hoshi's tears vanished and her frown turned into a bright smile. Izuku and Shuto exchanged looks, both thinking the same thing. They needed to keep her away from their mother for a while. Much like Rei's ability to have all 3 men of the household obey her, Hoshi seemed to have the same effect, and they both felt a mix of amusement and resolve. Izuku held Hoshi and looked at her with gentle affection. His icy blue eyes met her midnight blue ones, which reminded him of stars strewn across the sky. Her white hair framed her face and made her eyes even more striking. He would do anything to protect his family. Shudo's expression softened at the sight of Izuku's rare smile. Those smiles were increasingly uncommon, reserved mostly for family, especially Hoshi and Rei. Shudo thought back to his time with Hisashi and how well he had come to know him personally. Whenever he looked at Izuku, he was struck by the uncanny resemblance between father and son. If not for Izuku's hair, one might mistake him for Hisashi's twin. Shudo sighed and told Izuku that their parents were waiting. Izuku's once cheerful demeanor had been tempered into a more stoic, formal manner over the years. Training with Hisashi began with Izuku's cheerful childlike personality still dominant, but learning about clan history, politics, and the duties of a head gradually pushed his stoic side forward. The cheerful Izuku had been locked away for the sake of responsibility, and Shudo hoped someone would someday bring that smile back out. Someone jokingly asked if Shudo had lost control of his quirk and whether his big brother needed to save him, since he seemed frozen in place. Shudo's eye twitched, but he said nothing. Izuku walked toward the Kuchiki mansion with Hoshi perched on his shoulder, playing with his hair. Over the last 5 years, both he and Shudo had grown taller and stronger. Izuku now stood at 6 feet 1, while Shudo reached 5 feet 11. They approached the mansion, unaware of what awaited them inside. Hisashi greeted them warmly and sipped wine from his custom glass, while Rei quietly drank her tea. Hoshi cried out for her mother, and Izuku set her down as she ran into Rei's arms. Rei put her tea aside and sat Hoshi on her lap, stroking the child's hair. Izuku watched his mother, and the ring on her finger glinted in the light. Shudo and Rei were now legally Kuchiki. Izuku smiled as he recalled the earlier memory when Hisashi and Rei had nervously told them they were dating. The two adults had approached the boys, clearly anxious, and Hisashi had blurted out that he and Rei were a couple. Izuku and Shudo had reacted with casual indifference. Izuku mentioned he would not be calling Hisashi father anytime soon, and Shudo quietly agreed. Rei had asked if they were opposed to the idea, and Izuku had shrugged, reminding them that it had been hard not to know since they were often affectionate in the living room and had ignored the children's presence. Hisashi immediately reacted in frustration and told Shudo that they had not meant to tell the kids yet. Izuku warned them not to make their mother more embarrassed than necessary. Rei flushed deeply, and Hisashi showed a faint blush that quickly hardened into mock indignation as he demanded an apology for his own embarrassment. Shudo rubbed the back of his head where Izuku had lightly smacked him and apologized to their mother. Hisashi protested at being ignored. Izuku muttered that he wanted an older brother. No, scratch that, he wanted an older sister, and everyone heard the last part. Shudo glared and made it clear the feeling was mutual. Rei's blush deepened, heat rising to her face, and she suddenly fainted. Hisashi caught her immediately, his own face colored with concern, and he carried her toward her room with unsteady steps. The two brothers were left alone. Izuku offered a fist, Shudo bumped it, and Izuku declared that their mission to embarrass their parents had been accomplished. Izuku then snapped out of his trance and looked around the quiet room. Everyone except Hoshi, who had already fallen asleep, was staring at him. He asked why they were all looking at him. Rei pointed out that he had been smiling. Izuku explained that he had only been taking a trip down memory lane. Izuku asked their father why he had called them together. Hisashi's trademark smirk returned as he announced that it was time to reveal the future heads of the Kuchiki clan. The two brothers stared at each other in stunned silence. Hisashi took a sip of his wine and affirmed that the time had come. Izuku and Shudo sat in the Kuchiki family dojo, having just finished a training session. Both were out of breath and panting. Shudo asked whether Izuku had thought about what their father had said. Izuku answered that he had, and Shudo pressed him on whether he agreed. Izuku explained that he did. It would be a show of strength, it would raise the Kuchiki name among those who might not know it, and knowing the future head of the Kuchiki clan would be a hero studying at UA would increase their favor with other important people. Shudo sighed and observed that Izuku had clearly thought it through. Izuku maintained a deadpan expression and affirmed that of course he had. A maid called the young masters. Shoto asked what it was. The maid informed them that there were guests and that Lord Hisashi was calling for them. Shoto said they would be there shortly, and the maid bowed and excused herself. Izuku muttered about who would be visiting their father, but Shoto urged them to go. Entering the main house of the Kuchiki compound, Izuku did not expect to see a familiar face seated across from his father. The man was accompanied by two women, one appearing to be his wife and the other likely his daughter. Izuku noticed Shoto staring at the raven-haired girl beside them, a faint blush spreading across Shoto's pale cheeks. Izuku grinned and teased that Shoto could admire his crush later, only to be met with a sharp elbow to the stomach. After composing themselves, Izuku and Shoto stepped further into the room to make their presence known. Hisashi rose to greet them along with the guests. Izuku stepped forward and introduced the man as Haruto Yaoyorozu, CEO of Yaoyorozu Corporation, and shook his hand. Haruto was tall and muscular, with short, jet-black spiky hair and black eyes. Izuku remarked that he did not recall meeting Haruto before, and Hisashi, somewhat embarrassed, admitted he said interesting things when drunk. Haruto laughed, then moved to introduce himself to Shoto, and Shoto returned the courtesy. Haruto introduced his wife, Yoruchi, a lean woman with long black hair and gray eyes, who complimented the young men and said Hisashi had not stopped talking about them. Izuku nodded and Shoto smiled. Haruto then introduced his daughter, Momo. She had a poised figure and spiky black hair tied into a ponytail, with sharp black eyes. Momo bowed and offered her name politely, and Izuku and Shoto introduced themselves in turn. Izuku noticed Momo stealing glances at Shoto and inwardly smiled, pleased that the attraction seemed mutual. Izuku checked the mental connection with Senator. He asked whether Sen could feel emotions, and Sen nodded in the mind. Izuku asked what Momo was feeling toward Shoto. Sen declined to reveal that information, saying it was wrong to look into the mind of an ally, especially a lady. After a brief pause and a garbled interruption from Sen about interference, the connection was cut. Izuku muttered under his breath about Sen's hypocrisy. Conversation shifted when someone called out to Rei to check on Hoshi, and a light scuffle and insults followed between a couple of adults, prompting Hisashi to hold his head apologetically. Momo questioned the exchange, and the brothers reacted with confusion. Haruto chuckled and began to explain that he, Hisashi, Yoruchi, and another person who was better left unnamed went way back. Izuku interrupted to say he did not mind the other person's name, and Haruto recoiled at the boldness. Izuku explained that he felt nothing for that person. Momo whispered to Shoto to ask who Inko was, and Shoto's expression grew cold. He declined to explain, and Momo did not press further, but Izuku volunteered a brief explanation. He said Inko was his biological mother, and he emphasized the word biological. He recounted that he was born to Inko and his father, but that Inko had neglected him in favor of his biological sister after certain discoveries. Izuku said his father had left for their safety and faked his death, and that Izuku had run away and was now living with his adoptive mother, father, sister, and a younger brother. Rei and Hisashi smiled at the explanation while Shoto scowled in sympathy. Hisashi suggested that Rei and Yoruchi go check on Hoshi, and the two women left together, laughing at their familiarity. Hisashi then proposed that Izuku and Shoto show Momo around the compound while he and Haruto caught up. Momo agreed, but Izuku declined, saying he had some things to attend to. Momo smiled and accepted the excuse. As Izuku and Shoto departed, Shoto glanced back at Izuku, Hisashi, and Haruto one last time. All three men gave him a thumbs up. Izuku mouthed that Shoto owed him, expression blank. Hisashi mouthed that Shoto was his boy, smiling in a way that reminded Izuku uncomfortably of a snake. Haruto mouthed that he gave his blessings with a wide smile. He then muttered that he hated his life, though a faint blush betrayed his embarrassment. Someone called for Midoriya, and Shoto hurried away in response, saying he was coming. Izuku nodded and excused himself, leaving the two old friends to catch up. Izuku needed a break, so he left the Kuchiki compound on his own. The servants had insisted on accompanying him, but he quickly lost them. He wanted to walk. It had been a while since he had breathed the air outside the compound, the bustling crowd, the traffic, the revving engines, and the many shops trying to make a living all brought him a strange nostalgia. Thinking back, Izuku remembered how rough his start had been. Fate had not dealt him a kind hand, but he would not change it for the world. He had met Sun, Shoto, Rei, Hisashi, Hoshi, Vlad only because of Inko, Toshinori, and Izumi's negligence. In some way he felt gratitude toward them. He still wondered about the falling out that had occurred between Haruto and his father. An explosion a few streets away pulled his attention. He would not have time to wonder much longer. He rushed toward the smoke, his hand at his waist ready to summon Senbonzakura. Arriving at the scene, he saw a very familiar face and could not prevent a small, ecstatic smile from forming. The familiar figure remarked that it was a sight to behold, and that it had been a long time. Izuku pushed through the gathered crowd. People were taking pictures and videos without regard for their own safety, treating the crisis like entertainment. He scowled. These bystanders risked their lives and later blamed heroes when things went wrong. He was training to protect people like them. Putting that bitterness aside, Izuku looked around. Fire lighted at storefronts, and signs of explosions suggested gas lines had ignited. A passerby explained that a villain had emerged from the sewer system and was wreaking havoc. The man pointed toward the villain's torso and said that the creature had taken a child and was holding them. Izuku saw the child, a familiar-looking boy with ash-blonde hair, trapped against the villain. At the barriers stood a girl with green and blonde hair, shouting the boy's name. The passerby said his hearing was poor and that he hadn't caught the name clearly, only that she had been calling for the boy incessantly. Izuku recognized the names and murmured that the boy was Katsuki. The passerby reported that some heroes were on scene Death Arms and Mount Lady, but they had judged their quirks unsuitable for the current situation, and Mount Lady seemed distracted by the cameras. Others were doing what they could in the narrow streets. The man hoped a true hero would arrive soon. Despite the urgency, a smile tugged at Izuku's mouth. He sensed an ally nearby. Senbonzakura materialized before him, unseen by the crowd, and the blade presence assured Izuku that if he called, it would answer and cut anything in his way. Izuku trusted the blade and nodded. He stepped forward, passing through Senbonzakura as it shattered into a flurry of neon pink petals. The police tape split silently in two and fell to the ground. No one nearby had seen anything cut it. Izumi's whisper reached him, but he ignored it and moved into the fray. The crowd and a news camera focused on him now. The villain, with its back turned, shouted about the child's quirk and how it would use that power. The creature's words were full of menace, and Izuku stepped closer to interrupt it. The villain spun around, shocked to see Izuku so near. For the first clear view that day, Izuku looked at Katsuki. The boy's ash-blonde hair was messy and slick with sludge and his crimson eyes looked downcast. Izuku briefly wondered if he had given up hope, then dismissed the thought. The boy was far too prideful to surrender so easily. Izuku considered that the lack of oxygen might be affecting him and resolved to act. Izuku grabbed Katsuki by the hair, startling the villain, and yanked the semi-conscious boy from the creature's grasp with little resistance. He tossed Katsuki toward the hero Death Arms. For a split second, Izuku and Katsuki's eyes met and Izuku thought he saw a flicker of recognition in those crimson orbs. Katsuki landed in Death Arms' hold, and the sludge villain surged to engulf Izuku. The crowd shouted as the silver-haired boy was swallowed from view. Katsuki's breath hitched and he fell unconscious from the lack of air. Izumi rushed to Katsuki's side, leaving attention divided. The sludge villain proclaimed that if he could not have the one Katsuki sought, he would take Izuku instead, and then tried to consume Izuku completely. As the villain straightened, the crowd watched in horror as Izuku's form could be seen within the mass of sludge, as if the creature had swallowed him. All hope seemed lost until a bystander pointed out small ruptures forming on the creature's surface. Izuku's muffled voice came from inside the sludge, surprising the villain and everyone watching. The creature's outer layer began to split and tear. More and more of its sludge surface broke away. Pieces of the monster fell to the pavement, covering the street in green goop, and the villain staggered, overwhelmed by the damage. Tears streaked down the creature's face as it choked and writhed. Izuku finally forced himself free from the sludge. He stood dripping, his clothes ruined, and a powerful pulse of air issued from him that cleared the nearby flames and pushed the remaining filth away. He spat out the taste of sludge and muttered that it was disgusting as he glared at the cowering creature. The villain begged for mercy, promising servitude. Izuku, repulsed by the pleading, made a decisive motion. The sludge monster split apart and collapsed in inert heaps. A gust of air dispersed the remaining mass until nothing threatening remained. The short confrontation left a bitter taste in his mouth. He turned, silver hair catching the light, and ignored the stunned silence that broke into cheers from the crowd. 3 heroes approached. Kamui Woods moved forward with concern and asked if Izuku was all right. Izuku nodded. Death Arms scolded Izuku harshly, furious about the apparent recklessness and the danger it could have caused. Izuku ignored the anger and did not rise to the bait. Any lady offered a polite compliment and Izuku stepped away awkwardly. A reporter hurried up to the group, and the camera crew pushed past Death Arms to reach Izuku. The reporter bombarded him with rapid questions about his name, why he had intervened, what his quirk was, whether he knew the boy he had saved, any comment on the villain, and whether he was single or training to be a hero. Izuku sighed but answered what he could. He explained that he had saved the boy because that was what a hero would do. He noted that details of his quirk were classified, and he described the villain as pathetically weak with a specific vulnerability in its composition around the eyes that could have been exploited. Death Arms stepped forward, glaring, and argued that maiming a villain was wrong. Izuku pointed out that allowing a young boy to die would have been far worse. Death Arms bristled but had no immediate retort. The reporter asked again for his name. Izuku demurred, saying his name was of no importance. Death Arms scoffed and muttered that the young man was probably some no-name from the countryside, then took a few steps back. The man told the bystanders that he must get going. A reporter stepped forward to stop him, and a woman began to protest but went into shock when the handsome boy vanished without a trace. The woman then lamented that she had not even gotten his number. Izuku reappeared in an old, worn-down park he remembered clearly. The park sat several miles away from where the sludge villain incident had taken place, and reaching it in a few seconds left Izuku stunned. He marveled at the technique his father had taught him. Shuinpa, or the flash step, allowed the body to move by manipulating the spiritual energy within. He resolved to thank his father later. Izuku looked around the park with a sad smile. He fixed his gaze on a specific floor of a nearby apartment complex, the floor he and his family had lived on before they moved into a house. The park held many memories. He had never been bullied there, partly because he had not been known to be quirkless then. He shook his head, willing the bad memories away and focusing on the good ones. He sat on a rusty swing that was a little too small for him and pushed off the ground, sending up a small puff of dust. He sat for a while, remembering how he and Katsuki used to play together in this same park. Then he stood and walked to an old hollow tree beside a massive playground structure. The structure had colorful slides, large tunnels, monkey bars, and a small boxed area like a mini house designed for 2 to sit in at once. He looked at the hollow tree and saw the 3 letters I, K, and I carved into the wood: Izuku, Katsuki, and Izumi. Bittersweet thoughts filled him. Before he could sink further into memory, Sen spoke inside his mind and said that he sensed a presence in the structure. The presence was weak and should prove no threat, but Sen advised proceeding with caution if Izuku chose to investigate. Izuku thanked Sen and climbed onto the playground equipment to search for signs of life. He heard faint breathing from behind one of the tubes, hidden from sight. Moving cautiously with his hand near his hip, ready to summon Senbonzakura if necessary, he approached and found a girl with black hair lying on the old platform. She had a striking appearance. Izuku tried to wake her, but she did not respond. He checked her pulse and released a relieved breath. He noticed bruises on her pale skin and felt his breath hitch at the sight. He considered many possibilities. She might have been in a fight or fallen and hit her head, and he did not want to dwell on the worst scenarios. Unsure what to do next, he looked to his best friend, Sen, who materialized beside him and sensed his concern. Izuku asked Sen what to do, saying he could not leave the girl there. Sen suggested taking her back to the Kuchiki mansion. Leaving her in such a weakened and vulnerable state was not an option. Izuku protested that his parents would react poorly to seeing him carrying an unconscious, injured girl, and he worried about what people would think. Sen, hidden behind his mask, raised an eyebrow and reminded Izuku that he knew Shuunpa. Sen then set out to teach Izuku how to use the flash step while carrying someone. Izuku admitted he had just learned the technique and had no experience using it while carrying another person. Sen told him to pick up the girl. Izuku lifted her in a bridal carry and focused on matching his spiritual energy with hers. After some difficulty, he managed to match their energies. Sen instructed him to think of the direction he wanted to go as usual but to include the girl's energy in his focus. Izuku closed his eyes, felt a cool breeze, and opened them to see the clear blue sky. He realized he was flash-stepping, moving across the rooftops of the apartment buildings on the way. He breathed a quiet thanks to Sen and worried about how he would explain the situation to his mother without giving the wrong impression. He braced himself for a long conversation. Mayumi opened her eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling and felt aching pain. She looked around a room furnished with expensive pieces and stood to find a full-length mirror. Bandages wrapped her hands and legs, with more around her stomach. Her clothes were different and slightly too large, a plain t-shirt and tights. The door opened and Rei entered. Rei was startled to see the girl the boy had brought awake and was struck by the girl's clear blue eyes. Rei said that was good as she closed the door behind her and walked over to the sofa. She made herself comfortable and regarded the mystery girl with curious, slightly suspicious eyes. Rei introduced herself and asked the girl her name. Mayumi answered that her name was Mayumi Ishida. Rei then asked what she had been doing in the park and why there were bruises on her skin, her voice carrying authority. Mayumi quickly realized she was in the home of the renowned Kuchiki family but chose to focus on Rei's question. Mayumi admitted in a barely audible voice that she had run away from home and looked down, unable to meet Rei's inquisitive gaze. Rei asked why and then, hesitantly and with sensitivity, whether the reason for running away had to do with the marks on her body. Mayumi only nodded. Rei asked if Mayumi had been mistreated, careful with her tone because she knew how sensitive the topic could be from personal experience. When the girl seemed reluctant to continue, Rei shifted the subject to the clothes and mentioned that the garments she had been given were the only ones that fit and that they were Rei's old clothes. Rei stood and told Mayumi she could freshen up and to come downstairs when she was ready. Rei added that her family would be waiting and reassured Mayumi that they were kind and that she would not be overwhelmed. The motherly tone surprised Mayumi, and she nodded. Mayumi descended a long flight of stairs with stiffness and hesitancy. The house was richly decorated yet felt welcoming to an outsider. Rei noticed her and approached, asking if she had freshened up. Mayumi expressed her thanks, and Rei told her to think nothing of it and to call her Rei. Rei added that if anyone deserved thanks it was the person who had brought Mayumi there. When Mayumi asked who that was, Rei told her she would see soon enough and led her to a room. They entered a dining room where voices were arguing. The sound stopped when Rei announced that Mayumi was awake. The family of 4 at the table turned their attention to the raven-haired girl. Rei placed a comforting hand on Mayumi's shoulder and guided her to an empty chair beside the youngest child before sitting down herself. Rei urged Mayumi to eat, noting that she must be hungry. Mayumi nervously picked up her utensils and ate from the fine china in front of her, aware she was in the home of a powerful and wealthy family. Rei introduced the family. She presented her husband, Hisashi, and her youngest child, Hoshi, who waved happily at Mayumi. She introduced her middle child, Shoto, who looked at Mayumi with indifference, and then the eldest, Izuku, who had been the one to find Mayumi. Mayumi looked at Izuku with gratitude. Izuku found himself glancing at Mayumi and noticed her unusual, deep blue eyes, but he also sensed something was off. He stiffened briefly when Senbenzakura's voice interjected unexpectedly. Senbenzakura downplayed it and said it was nothing Izuku needed to concern himself with. Mayumi offered thanks and said she would like to repay Rei for her kindness. Izuku told her there was no need for repayment and that a true hero would help someone in need. Rei explained that both Izuku and Shoto had been training for years and intended to apply for the upcoming UA Heroics exam, and she assumed Mayumi might be pursuing the same goal. Mayumi said that her father had never wanted her to become a hero, but she had dreamed of saving people since she was little. Izuku asked about her quirk, and Mayumi explained that she could bend water and even control water molecules in the air, though doing so could leave her severely dehydrated and vulnerable. Hisashi murmured that the name Ishida sounded familiar, and when asked about the family, he confirmed he had met Mayumi's father once and remembered him as proud but honest and strong. He then asked why Mayumi had run away. The question felt piercing, and Mayumi felt herself shrink under his gaze. Rei noticed her discomfort and gave Hisashi a glare. He took the hint and sighed. Hisashi then told Mayumi she could stay as long as she needed and that the staff would prepare her room. Mayumi began to say she did not want to trouble them and would leave soon, but Hisashi asked where she would go. Mayumi looked to Izuku but remained silent. After finishing his meal, Izuku cleaned his hands and mouth with a napkin and stood, making sure Hoshi, who had climbed on top of him, did not fall. Izuku told Mayumi that she did not need to feel like a burden there, his icy blue eyes meeting her deep blue ones. Hisashi said it would not be a problem to house one more person. He looked at his father, who nodded in agreement. Rei added that she would be with Vlad and to call her if anything was needed. Rei sighed, and Mayumi looked at her questioningly. Rei shook her head. Rei then told everyone to eat before the food got cold. The family and their guest ate in comfortable silence, the only sound coming from Shoto as he slurped his soba. Mayumi stared toward the door for a moment before returning to her meal. Sin sat lost in thought, choosing to tune out the rhythm of a hammer striking metal. He found the situation intriguing and watched the pale sky with a quiet smile, thinking that things were about to become far more interesting. Mayumi woke to an unfamiliar ceiling for the second time. As she sat up, a wave of pain reminded her that her bruises had yet to heal. She thought the sleep had done her good and went to the adjoining bathroom to freshen up. After changing into the clothes Rei had left for her, she stepped into a long corridor and paused, uncertain of where to go. Rei approached and asked if she was awake. Mayumi returned that she had rested well and hoped Rei had too. Rei smiled and said she had slept well and suggested they get breakfast. The two walked together through the mansion, and Mayumi admired the grandeur of the house. It was far larger than the Ishida home. Rei watched the girl's curious gaze with a fondness that reminded her of when Izuku and Shoto had been younger, and she sighed at how much the boys had grown, Shoto more expressive, Izuku more reserved. At the dining table, Hisashi greeted them and sat at the head with Hoshi on his lap. A chair next to him had been set out for Rei. Izuku and Shoto were already seated. Rei guided Mayumi to the left side of the table and motioned for her to sit next to her, opposite Izuku. An elderly man with gray hair tied back in a thin ponytail stood nearby. A thin vertical scar marked his lip. Rei introduced him as Vlad, the family's butler and Izuku's mentor. Mayumi bowed as she sat, and offered a polite greeting. Vlad returned the gesture with a warm wave, the lines at his eyes showing his years. Hisashi remarked that Mayumi must be hungry. At his gesture, a different door opened and several maids entered carrying plates, cutlery, and food. Hisashi apologized for the earlier lack of proper courtesy, explaining the chefs had been unavailable and hoped the meal would make up for it. His smile was courteous, but it set Mayumi on edge. She shook her head emphatically and insisted she had been treated more than kindly and that she would not impose further. After the meal, she intended to take her leave. Shoto asked if she had healed already, surprising Mayumi. She confirmed that she had. Hoshi, who had crawled into Rei's lap, poked Mayumi gently in the ribs, and Mayumi winced. Rei told her there was no need to pretend and that she and the boys insisted Mayumi could stay as long as she liked. Izuku and Shoto agreed with their father, and Mayumi accepted the offer with relief as they began to eat. Later, Mayumi found herself being led by the hand by the toddler Hoshi, who proudly showed her around the grounds. Hoshi pointed out the pond where ducks lived and explained that he and his mother sometimes came to feed them. He then tugged her toward the workshop and said that Izuku liked to work there with a hammer and that Grandpa also worked with hammers and had taught Izuku. His excited explanation made it clear that Vlad was not just a butler in upbringing but a grandfatherly figure who taught and made things for the family. Hoshi bounded with childish enthusiasm, saying that Izuku and Shoto must be training now and pulling Mayumi toward the brothers. His bright eyes and energy enchanted Mayumi, and she let herself be led along. Vlad was the first to notice the new presence because Izuku and Shoto were engrossed in a friendly training match. The brothers were focused and energetic, exchanging practiced moves in a spirited, anime-style sparring bout that showed skill and discipline without any graphic detail. Vlad greeted Ishida-sama as he arrived. Hoshi leapt into the old man's arms and announced that she wanted to come too. Vlad laughed, spun her around, and settled her on his shoulders. Vlad asked Mayumi what had brought them there. Mayumi said quietly that Hoshi had brought her, and Vlad nodded in understanding. He then reminded Hoshi of the two places she was forbidden to go. Hoshi stammered out the smithy and the training ground and apologized. Vlad accepted the apology and told Hoshi not to come back without her mother or father. Hoshi nodded. Vlad explained that the only reason anyone would come to the training grounds was to train. He oversaw the sparring sessions, which were stylized bouts where fighters pushed each other to their limits until one yielded. Sometimes, when he was in a difficult mood, he would join and be sparred against by two brothers until the matriarch intervened. Since they were already there, Vlad suggested they watch. Mayumi stepped forward and stood next to him. She finally took in the training grounds, a large open area with a metallic foundation, and opposite them the two Kuchiki brothers preparing to spar. Vlad ordered them to start, his booming command taking Mayumi by surprise while Hoshi remained unfazed. The brothers' match began. Izuku asked for the score, and Shoto scoffed before planting his foot and unleashing a rush of ice that shot toward Izuku. Mayumi could tell the ice was fast and powerful. Izuku dodged with graceful movement and closed the distance. Shoto raised his arms and formed a column of ice beneath his feet. He placed a hand on the column, sent two tendrils of ice at Izuku, and the white-haired boy advanced. Izuku evaded one tendril and cut the other with his sheathed sword, then briefly drew the blade before forcing it back into the scabbard. A horizontal arc of pink petals followed his swing and bisected the ice column. Shoto dropped down where Izuku had stood, his feet still encased in ice. He warned that he was getting serious, and chills slipped from his breath as ice crawled up his arm to form gauntlets. He adopted a brawler's stance, a stark contrast to Izuku's more elegant posture. Shoto launched himself at Izuku. Izuku parried the punch with the sheath of sen in his left hand and countered with a downward strike. Shoto spun, kicked the sword with his ice-covered shoe, and threw Izuku off balance. He landed a punch to Izuku's chest, but Izuku blocked it in time, leapt back, and sent another sweeping blade of petals, this time at higher speed. Shoto slammed both hands into the ground and let the ice gauntlets recede into the floor, raising a dense wall of ice. Izuku drove his sword forward and pierced the wall rather than slashing it, causing it to crumble. They readied themselves to continue when Vlad called them to stop and then issued another instruction. Ishida-sama was to join the match. Mayumi blinked in confusion, having been completely absorbed by the display of skill. Vlad ordered Shoto to team up with Ishida-sama against Izuku. Izuku, busily sweeping away the remaining ice, shook his head to indicate he had no objection. Shoto grumbled but agreed. Mayumi hesitated, unsure what was expected of her. Vlad told her to go and not to hold back. Hoshi wished her luck. Mayumi, still uncertain, moved to stand beside Shoto and asked why she had been brought in. Shoto admitted he did not know Vlad's reason and instructed her to follow his lead, to try to sync with him, to keep her distance when necessary, and never to let her guard down. When Mayumi asked what he could do, Shoto signaled that he was ready. Vlad restarted the bout. Shoto surged forward, reconstructing his ice gauntlets. Mayumi followed closely. She had no water on her person but could draw on the moisture in the air and surroundings without overexerting herself. Shoto went straight for Izuku, and the three engaged. Shoto's punches were met by Izuku's parries. Izuku struck and Shoto blocked. Izuku caught Shoto's right hand and braced for another blow, catching the left hand as well. Shoto smirked and let ice stream toward Izuku, attempting to bind him. Izuku sensed danger behind him and dodged an arc of sharp water sent his way. Shoto's momentum carried him along with Izuku. Izuku focused his spiritual pressure, cracking the ice that had bound him and kicking Shoto away, but a slashing wave of water grazed him. He barely blocked another such attack sent by Mayumi using her sheathed sword as a guard. She then unleashed a flurry of pink petals that neutralized a trap she had set, making it ineffective. Mayumi muttered that Izuku was strong, frustrated at how he could hold his own or even exceed against two opponents. Shoto appeared at her side and remarked that his strength was frustrating but that one grew accustomed to it. They decided to raise the cold together. Mayumi raised her hands and began to form hundreds of small balls of water above them, which slowly took the shape of spikes. The effort left her slightly winded. Shoto inhaled, letting out a frosty breath, and lifted his hands to send a blast of cold air upward. He explained to Mayumi that he did not yet have complete mastery over ice and could not form objects without physical support. He used his body as an anchor for the ice gauntlets and could manipulate ice to an extent but could not yet create complex structures on his own. Mayumi observed that their abilities complemented each other. The water spheres she had formed condensed into dense spikes of ice, with Mayumi providing the ammunition and Shoto providing the control that gave the attack its deadly precision. Shoto made it stronger and more durable. Mayumi manipulated the ice and sent it toward Izuku, who watched with curiosity. Mayumi could manipulate the temperature of water, but lowering the temperature of this much water would nearly kill her or at the very least incapacitate her. Izuku smiled at the two quickly adapting to each other and drew Senbenzakura, facing the approaching danger without fear. The spirit of Sin appeared and instructed Izuku to cut, pierce, or block all of the spikes, not to dodge, not to rely on the spirit, but to use his eyes. Izuku nodded, understanding that this was a lesson, and glared at the incoming ice. Mayumi watched worriedly while Shoto grinned. Vlad looked indifferent and Hoshi looked afraid until Vlad pulled her down and rubbed her head to calm her. Someone observed that Shoto could not perform such a feat on his own. The ice was upon him. He stared straight ahead, katana in his right hand and sheath in his left, determined to use the challenge as inspiration. He easily cut the first spike and, with that cut, sliced through several more. He blocked a few with his sheath. Those struck by the sheath shattered from the impact. He cut to the right in a vertical arc and swung the sheath to the left in a horizontal slash. He sustained wounds to his cheek, leg, and arm but did not dodge. He glanced at Hoshi and felt relieved that Vlad had covered her eyes. He cut and blocked many more attacks until the wave finally ended. He panted, wincing from the pain. Sen asked why he had told him not to use the spirit. Izuku answered that he thought Sen wanted him to get hurt. The spirit replied that he still had much to learn. Izuku muttered that his Zanpakuto was stupid. Izuku refocused and noticed the new duo doing something. He saw Mayumi's hand hovering over Shoto's and Shoto panting. His right hand was covered in a thin sheet of ice, a sign of overexertion. Mayumi was also panting and flushed. Her injuries had not healed, and Izuku wondered why Vlad had sent an injured person to fight. Shoto grunted that it was done. Izuku looked at Shoto's hand and saw him holding a katana made completely of ice. It looked plain, but Izuku knew better than to judge. Izuku remarked that Shoto could finally put his training to use, feeling smug but also a bit happy. Shoto had invested as much time training with a sword as Izuku had. Izuku envied that Shoto had the chance to wield a proper blade. A normal sword could not withstand Izuku's blows, and Shoto could not yet create a sword of ice as durable as gauntlets. Shoto thanked Izuku using his family name, and said it had been some time since he had held a blade capable of surviving that kind of onslaught. He looked at Mayumi and smiled, telling her she had done enough and should rest because she was injured. Mayumi agreed that rest would be good and thanked him formally. Shoto asked her to call him Shoto. Shoto approached Izuku and asked where they had left off. Izuku smirked and reminded him of the score. 18 to he swung his blade, and cherry blossom petals followed. Izuku aimed to make it 9 for himself and hovered a hand along Shoto's ice katana, noting how dense the ice was thanks to Mayumi's help. Izuku declared he would see if Shoto's training had paid off. They prepared to resume the duel. Both brothers ran at each other, clashing their swords together. The ice sword withstood the blow from Senbenzakura. The two engaged in a power struggle, eyes locked as each tested the other's resolve. Izuku observed Shoto's determination and admired the ice katana, a testament both to Mayumi's support and Shoto's control. The blade was so dense that it withstood a blow from a Zanpakuto, and vapor rose from the blue edge as Shoto put his all into forming it. Izuku decided to stop holding back and to push Shoto as a goal to reach for the art of the blade. A graceful pink aura rose from Izuku's body, surprising Shoto. Izuku felt pride that his brother had improved at sensing spiritual pressure. Vlad glanced at the trembling, fatigued girl and was not surprised at her reaction. Any beginner who could see Izuku's aura would be shaken. Hoshi murmured that it was pretty, and Vlad tightened his hold on her with a proud smile, thinking the future of the Kuchiki clan looked bright. Izuku warned Shoto that he was going all out and told him not to fall. Taking those words as encouragement, Shoto braced himself as Izuku parried Shoto's blade and swung horizontally in his direction. With a burst of Ryatsu, a vertical aura shot toward Shoto accompanied by cherry blossoms. Shoto blocked it without much difficulty, grunted, and charged. Shoto formed ice beneath his feet to slide forward with greater speed, attempting to strike from the side. He brought his sword down, but Izuku spun and evaded the blow. Izuku recovered quickly and kicked the ground. An ice spike shot up, and Izuku cut it. Shoto seized the opening and slashed again. Izuku called on Sen, and a wall of pink flowers blocked Shoto's strike and obscured his view. Shoto pushed more of his quirk into a slash to clear the petals. He did not find Izuku behind the wall, but when a shadow loomed, he guessed where his brother stood. He leapt away just in time to avoid a jump attack, but Izuku did not relent. Izuku rushed after Shoto, who tried to halt his advance by acting walls of ice. Every wall Shoto placed was cut apart by Izuku, and Senator growing frustrated, Shoto launched himself back at Izuku with renewed aggression. Shoto struck repeatedly, and each time Izuku blocked him. Shoto screamed, drove his sword into the ground, and glared at Izuku. He gripped the hilt with both hands and let out another cry. Cold vapor rose from his body and a thin sheet of blue crept up his skin. His hair stiffened as if frozen. From the point where the sword met the earth, ice spread across the arena like a creeping frost. It crawled toward Izuku until it erupted into spikes that trapped the long-haired boy. Izuku grunted, and many petals appeared to assist him. The petals sliced through the ice like paper. Frustration grew in Shoto. He pulled his sword free and charged Izuku again. He struck with greater force. Izuku held the blow. He slashed harder a second time. Izuku evaded. He switched to punching. Izuku pushed his hand away. Shoto let out a cry. A thin, nearly invisible aura cloaked Shoto. His blue eyes flashed silver for a heartbeat, and in that instant he missed what had been before. Izuku was startled, and the katana followed through on that moment. The blade found its mark, opening a wound across Izuku's chest. Izuku staggered. Shoto faltered and stared at the tip of his blade. His faint veil of Ryatsu began to thin and then faded. Izuku relayed Sen's instruction to him without hesitation, telling Shoto not to let that feeling fade away, to remember that strength and power. Shoto looked confused as he glanced between his sword and Izuku. His veil of Ryatsu continued to ebb until it disappeared. Sen observed everything and thought that he had noticed this long ago. Staying close to Izuku as children must have allowed Shoto's minuscule Ryatsu to inch through the barrier that normally keeps humans from touching the world of spirits. Izuku's Ryatsu had influenced Shoto's, Sen reasoned. But an ordinary human not from a lineage should not possess such strong Ryatsu. Shoto's power was unrefined and barricaded, yet it bore a resemblance to a lineage Sen recognized, and another reason for the process came into focus. Izuku urged them to go again, and Shoto nodded numbly. Izuku rushed at him, and this time Shoto found himself on the defensive. Izuku reminded Shoto that even prey, when cornered, could become predator and challenged him to choose which he would be. Metal rang as Shoto defended and was pushed back. Izuku sighed. None of the others here could give him a true fight. Shoto was skilled, but the gap between them was wide. Hisashi was like a sky he could only glimpse, and Vlad like a sun that would scorch his eyes if he tried to stare directly. Izuku glanced at Mayumi. She remained an unknown variable, her true strength hidden. His next hope for a real challenge lay at Yue, but that was still a way off. He looked back into Shoto's determined gaze and resolved to help Shoto become a challenge. Izuku backed away and warned Shoto that this would be his strongest move and to stay alive. Shoto looked shocked but nodded. Backing down would betray the name of Kuchiki. Vlad glanced at Mayumi and then toward the fight. He drew Hoshi close and turned her head away so she would not have to see the climax. Vlad instructed Mayumi not to look away. Mayumi reacted with confusion. A surge of Ryatsu burst from Izuku, the blue aura shading slightly toward pink. He spread his legs, extended his left arm toward Shoto as if to aim, and drew his right hand back with the sword poised to move. Shoto felt a chill climb his spine and thought about how powerful Izuku had become. He considered himself weak and feared he could not withstand the attack, but he vowed to pour all his strength into his strongest defensive move. Shoto cried out and planted both hands on the ground. A silvery, thin aura traced his form. In an instant a strange structure rose from the earth, not a simple wall but a gate of white ice that resembled a traditional Japanese torii, carved of frost instead of wood. Izuku warned Shoto to brace himself. Izuku moved his blade forward and hundreds, perhaps thousands, of petals streamed from it. They swirled through the air and, from Mayumi and Vlad's vantage point, formed a dense horizontal pillar of pale pink. The petals struck Shoto's only defense. They shattered against the ice gate, and the gate began to crack under the onslaught. Despite the gate's resilience, the sword expected from a spiritual blade, it could not withstand Izuku's quirk at full force. It splintered and collapsed. The petals surged through the broken defense and rushed toward the panting Shoto. They struck him and left him staggered and overwhelmed, though they did not strike any vital points. Shoto cried out and, pushed beyond his limits, collapsed from exhaustion and overuse of his power. He fell unconscious, pale from the strain. Izuku stood panting, sweat trickling down his brow. He dropped to one knee. The katana dissolved into a scatter of petals and drifted away on the breeze. Mayumi and Hoshi hurried toward the two while Vlad looked across the training ground, contemplating how he would explain the outcome to Madame Ray. Senbenzakura observed Shoto with a thoughtful expression hidden beneath his mask. Invisible to all but Senator Senbenzakura murmured that the boy had potential and would be perfect for what was to come. He acknowledged, though, that there were far more pressing matters ahead and that it was time for Izuku to step into the world of adults.